Morning, Michelle.
Hi guys, how are you?
Doing well, thank you.
Good.
You moderating our session, I think?
I am, but I think I'm supposed to be in like a waiting room.
Oh.
Oh, Chris? Looks like he's here.
Hi, Michelle. Sorry, I'll get you in the room in just a sec here.
No problem. How you doing, Ed? Everybody fine?
Good, yeah, everything's good. A little early, but it'd be even earlier if we were actually, if I'd actually traveled to that side of the country.
That's right.
Yeah. The online conference works pretty well in terms of the sessions and convenience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's good.
Okay, Michelle, I'm going to send you an Ed off, and then when Christina and Roger, when I see them, I'll send them over as well.
Okay, thank you, Chris.
Sure. Okay, you've both been promoted, so back to the breakout for both of you.
Okay, I think we can get started. It's 10 a.m. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of the JAE conference for 2020. We have 2 papers today, and they will follow the same format and same structure that we had yesterday. And hopefully the discussion will be as lively. I thought yesterday was great. Before we get started, I wanted to thank Wayne Gay for hosting the wine tasting last night. That was a lot of fun and educational. It wasn't Fenway Park, but it was very good for something we could do over Zoom. And thanks a lot, Wayne, for taking the time to get that together and host that for us last night. That was a lot of fun. Also, I'd like to thank the PhD students who came to the session yesterday that John and Mark and I hosted. We hope you learned something. It was very nice to meet you over Zoom, and we all look forward to meeting you in person very soon. So with that, we'll start the first session, and Christina Zhu from Wharton will present her paper, and Roger Edelin from Virginia Tech will discuss the paper. Each will have roughly 20 minutes, and then we'll go to the Q&A. So Christina?
All right, thank you, Michelle. Also, I want to thank the JAE editors for including this paper in the conference. I really enjoyed the papers from yesterday's sessions, and I also enjoyed the wine tasting. Wayne, wine tasting is a tough act to follow, but I'm excited to kick off day 2 of the conference. So I'm Christina Zhu, I'm from the Wharton School, and this paper is co-authored work with Ed DeHaan and Yang Song from the University of Washington and Chloe Xie from MIT. And in this paper, we study obfuscation in mutual funds. So why do we study mutual funds? Well, the mutual fund market is large. They hold 32% of US equity market value, and they're popular with retail investors. In fact, they comprise 58% of retirement savings. But despite the popularity of mutual funds, retail investors have been shown in prior literature to consistently make poor choices when it comes to selecting mutual funds. So they invest in funds that underperform. They invest in funds with high fees when similar funds are available. And this has been shown in several prior papers. And then the question is, how can we have such a large mutual fund market where retail investors consistently make such poor choices? Now, there isn't just one reason for this phenomenon, but one important reason is obfuscation. And we rely on theory and finance to test whether there might be strategic obfuscation going on. So specifically, we test whether mutual funds create unnecessarily complex disclosures and fee structures in order to obfuscate weak net performance. Now, to do this, we hold constant non-discretionary complexity. And we do that by focusing on S&P 500 index funds, which are homogeneous, simple entities. Now, you might be thinking, should there be even different fees for entities as simple and homogeneous as S&P 500 index funds? Well, in fact, there are big differences. On this slide, I have Schwab and Deutsche, and both of these are major institutions. They've existed for several years. They're widely available. They hold basically the same S&P 500 stocks. They're also subject to the same US regulations. If we take a look at the standard deviation of those returns, they're pretty much the same. The gross returns for 2019 are pretty much identical. But then we take a look at their fees. And their fees are wildly different. For Schwab has fees of 2 basis points in 2019, while Deutsche has fees of up to 506 basis points. Now, that has a big impact on their net returns. What I've done here is I've plotted the distribution of fees for our sample in 2017. So on the x-axis, we have the fees in basis points. And then on the y-axis, we have the percentage of the sample with those fees. Now, retail investors in 2017 invested $72 billion in high fee funds. So the top 80% of fees, the fees above the 20th percentile. Now, if they had instead invested in low fee funds, which is the fees in the lowest 20%, they would have saved $358 million in 2017 alone. Now, that compounds to $6.9 billion in retirement savings over 30 years. So why is this going on, right? As I mentioned, we're going to rely on theory in finance, intuition from this theory to understand what's going on here. So in Carlin 2009, identical funds compete for investors. And there are two types of investors. The first type is the informed investor. And the informed investor, he or she understands the fees that he or she must pay and therefore buys the cheapest fund. Now, uninformed investors, on the other hand, they attempt to read fund disclosures and understand the fees that they must pay, but they find it too difficult. So instead, they just choose randomly. They buy a random fund. Now, funds can increase the complexity of their product in order to increase the cost of becoming informed, therefore increasing the proportion of uninformed investors. And aggregate complexity is determining the fraction of uninformed investors. So let me repeat that. Here we have an example with half informed investors, half uninformed investors, and the fraction of the uninformed investors is determined by the aggregate complexity. Now, funds can increase the complexity, therefore increasing the proportion of uninformed investors and thus increasing the investment in all of the funds that are not the cheapest fund. Now, because fund managers are compensated based on assets under management, they want to increase the investment in their own fund. So we have the strategic manager, the fund manager, and he or she is going to choose one of two strategies, either the simple fund strategy or the complex fund strategy. And in the Carlin 2009 model, a mixed strategy equilibrium emerges, where funds are going to mix over the complex strategy or the simple strategy, and that simply means that we should observe low fees along with simple disclosures and fee structures, and then high fees along with complex disclosures and fee structures. And that's the portion that's empirically observable. Now, this strategic obfuscation would be consistent with several decades of SEC efforts to reduce complexity. And those efforts culminate in ongoing regulation. This is an August 2020 proposed rule to improve fund disclosures. Now, our approach is to isolate the discretionary choices from non-discretionary complexity. So here I have the mixed strategy equilibrium from the Carlin 2009 model again, and I've drawn a red box around what we are testing. We are simply testing for a positive correlation between fees and complexity, which would be consistent with the equilibrium coming out of that model. Now, our setting will hold constant risks, regulations, and gross returns. Again, we're focusing on homogeneous, simple entities, S&P 500 index funds. Now, the predictions that rely on the intuition from the model are that high fees should be associated with greater narrative complexity. And by narrative complexity, I mean measures based on SEC guidance, as well as measures based on corporate disclosure readability literature. And the second prediction that we have is that high fees should be associated with greater structural complexity. And by structural complexity, I mean the number of share classes, loads, complex types of fees. Now, I think it makes sense to pause here and talk a little bit about how mutual funds actually work. So on the left here, I have Schwab and Deutsche. That's the institution or the fund family. And Schwab and Deutsche can issue several different funds. One of them is the S&P 500 index fund. That's the subject of our study. They can also have several other different funds, active funds, the Russell 2000 fund, for example. And each fund is composed of several fund classes, which is a choice by the fund. Those fund classes have the same assets and the same gross returns, but on the right here, I'm showing that they can have different costs. There are different types of fees. There's the annual fee, there's a front load, there's a back load, waivers, marketing fees, and other types of fees, and those can differ across the different classes. Mutual funds also issue prospectuses, And prospectus disclosures contain information on the investment objectives, on the fees, on risks, and other details. And they can contain multiple funds, so S&P 500 index fund, Russell 2000 fund, any other fund, or they can just contain a single fund. And these prospectus disclosures are available on fund websites and third-party trading websites. So what composes a prospectus? So a prospectus is composed of two parts. And the second part is the details section. So this contains all the details about the S&P 500 index fund. If the fund chose to include other funds in the prospectus, it would include details, all that information for the other funds as well. And then we have that first part. And that first part is called the summary section. Now this was mandatory only since 2010. It can be disseminated separately. And the purpose of the summary section is to synthesize in a concise manner what is in the details section. So that's going to be something like a Cliff Notes version of what's in the details section. Now, based on prospectuses, we have 4 measures of narrative complexity. Our first measure is the number of funds that the fund chooses to include in one filing. And the reason we have this measure is that the SEC has stated multiple times that they don't like it when funds put multiple funds in one prospectus. It makes it difficult for an investor to identify the funds that he or she must pay based on their fund that they chose. The second one is repetition between the summary section and the details section. The SEC has also commented that they don't like when funds simply repeat what's in the details section in the summary section, when it's really meant to be a concise summary. And then our third and fourth measures are length and words per sentence, and those represent the quantity and the clarity of information that's based on the corporate disclosure readability literature. So as an example of repetition between the summary and the detail section, here I have Schwab's summary for equity risk and tracking error risk, and then on the right here, I've pasted Schwab's detail sections for the same disclosures. So the summary is meant to summarize what's in the detail section. And what I've highlighted on the right here are the sentences that are exactly repeated in the detail section for that summary section. Now remember, Schwab is that low fee fund, and we see that some of those sentences are repeated exactly rather than summarized. Now then we take a look at Deutsche. Remember, Deutsche is that high fee fund. And for Deutsche's stock market risk, which is equity risk, and their indexing risk, they simply copied and pasted the entire detail section into their summary section. So the SEC would say something like, they have not summarized this information, they've simply repeated the information. Taking a look at length and words per sentence, for Schwab's investment objective section, they use 14 words to describe their investment objective. Now let's contrast that with Deutsche. They use 60 words to describe the same investment objective, and they use many long sentences and length elsewhere in the prospectus as well. Then we take a look at structural complexity as well, right? We have the narrative complexity piece, now we're talking about the structural complexity piece. Now the first measure of structural complexity that we use is the number of share classes that are offered by the fund. The second one is the number of breakpoints in the front load. So the front load is something that investors have to pay just to get into the investment. And the front load breaks can be based on the investment level. The third measure is the number of breaks in the rear load. And a rear load, just like a front load, you have to pay something to get out of the investment. And that's going to depend on the horizon of the investment. And then the fourth measure is the front load indicator. The fifth measure is an indicator for not having a load, but having a 12B1 fee, which is a marketing and distribution fee. Now we also combine these 5 measures of structural complexity into a single principal component called structural complexity. And the anecdotal evidence with Schwab and Deutsche also shows that Schwab has low structural complexity and Deutsche, the high fee fund, has high structural complexity. So our empirical strategy is to use the retail share classes of S&P 500 index funds from 1994 to 2017. And we match fees and structures to fund prospectuses. Now that means that our analyses are at the fund year level because prospectuses are available for funds and not for separate share classes. And our final sample is 38 unique funds, 458 fund years. We also do some analyses on the specific expense disclosure in the summary section. That's only available since 2010. So then our sample for those disclosures is reduced to 28 funds and 123 fund years. And for our measure of fees, we are measuring fees as the total cost of ownership. So that's going to include not just the annual fee, but also the loads amortized over a holding period. So what we're going to do here is, what I've shown here is, again, the outcomes of the Carlin 2009 model, which is low fees along with simple disclosures and fee structures, and high fees along with complex disclosures and fee structures. So we're testing for what I've drawn a red box around, the outcomes of that model, which means that fees can be either on the left-hand side or right-hand side. There's nothing causal about this model. We're simply testing for a positive association between fees and complexity, which is predicted by this mixed strategy equilibrium. So we choose to include fees on the left-hand side because then we can include multiple measures of complexity together on the right-hand side. So we're looking for whether or not that beta coefficient that I've circled is positive, also known as we're looking for a positive correlation between fees and complexity. So we're also including year fixed effects to remove any year-specific regulations, other trends in fees and complexity. And just looking at our first prediction, which is that high fees should be associated with greater narrative complexity, we do find this result. So what I've done here is I've plotted the fee quintile on the x-axis, and then on the y-axis, I have our 4 measures of narrative complexity. And you can see that as the fee quintile increases, so does that narrative complexity measure. Now, turning to the regression results, when we regress fees on complexity, we find in column 1 that high fee funds tend to include more funds in one filing. That's something that the SEC does not like. High fee funds are also more likely to repeat rather than summarize what's in the detail section in their summary section, which is meant to be a summary. When we look at length and words per sentence in the 3rd and 4th columns, we don't find as much there. Again, those are measures that are not necessarily based on SEC guidance, so we don't put as much weight on those measures. Turning to column 5, then we include all 4 measures together, and we again see that funds in filing and repetition between the summary and the details section are positively correlated with fees. In column 6, we use robust regression to mitigate the impact of influential observations, and we again find that funds in filing and the repetition between the summary and the details section are both positively correlated with fees. We also look specifically at the expense disclosure. So these tests are powerful because they're looking specifically at the disclosure about the fees that investors must pay. So looking at funds in filing and repetition in column 1, again, we again find that in the post-2010 sample, both of those are positively correlated with fees. In the 3rd column, the length of the expense disclosure and the words per sentence of the expense disclosure in the 4th column are both positively correlated with fees. Now then, looking at column 5, we include all 4 measures of the expense disclosure together. Just a side note, because the length and the words per sentence of the expense disclosure are highly correlated with each other, we combine them into a single principal component called wordiness of the expense disclosure. So in column 5, we find that all of those measures are positively correlated with fees. And then in column 6, we look at robust regression again, and we again find that all of those measures are positively correlated with fees. Turning to our structural complexity results, we do find that high fees are associated with greater structural complexity as well. And here I've just plotted the fee quintile on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, I have the structural complexity principal component. We see that as the fee quintile increases, so too does that structural complexity measure. And then in the regression results, we see that in the first 5 columns, share classes, the number of front load breaks, the number of rear load breaks, front load indicator, and an indicator for not having a load but having a 12B1 fee, all 5 of those measures are positively correlated with fees. And in that 6th column, we show that the structural complexity principal component is also positively correlated with fees. 7th column, robust regression, same results. And even in the expense disclosure sample, which is the post-2010 sample, we again find positive and significant coefficients on all of our measures of structural complexity. But going back to that regression, we want to look at some specific disclosures, okay? Because one validity threat is that there could be a variable that's correlated with both fees and complexity in a manner that could cause correlated omitted variable bias. Now, one such candidate for a validity threat is that our proxies of narrative complexity actually unintentionally capture structural complexity. So to make that example more concrete, let's imagine that a fund has chosen a very complex fee structure. And in order to describe that fee structure, the fund has to use more words and make a longer prospectus in order to describe that fee structure. So really they're choosing the structures, but then length and words per sentence are coming along for the ride. So to address that validity threat, we do several things. Well, first, our first two measures of narrative complexity should be free from that validity threat. Both funds and filing and the repetition between the summary and the detail section should not be affected by the fee structures that funds choose. But we also go further and we look at specific disclosures that should be completely orthogonal to the effects of structural complexity. Now, what are those disclosures? The first one is the objective statement. So the objective statement of the fund should simply state that the fund seeks to track the S&P 500 index. And that should have nothing to do with the structural complexity of the fund. And then the second specific disclosure we look at is the equity risk disclosure. And equity risk is simply the risk that equity prices can rise and fall. And so funds disclose this risk. Again, it has nothing to do with structural complexity. And when we look at those specific disclosures, in that top table, we're looking at the objective statement. And we find that the length of the objective statement in column 1 is positively correlated with fees. The words per sentence of the objective statement are not so much correlated with fees. We see that in the third column, that in robust regression, we also find that the length of the objective statement is positively correlated with fees. Now, in that bottom table, now I'm looking at the equity risk disclosure. And what we've done is we've taken the equity risk disclosure in the summary section and the equity risk disclosure in the details section. Remember that summary section is meant to summarize what's in the details. And in the first column, we show that funds are less likely to summarize what's in the detail equity risk disclosure when they have higher fees. In the second column, I'm showing that funds are more likely to summarize 0% of what's in the equity risk disclosure in the detail section. They repeat everything. And then in the third and fourth columns, we also find that the length and the words per sentence of the equity risk disclosure are positively correlated with fees. And that's important because one of our contributions is to isolate that narrative complexity and show that funds choose greater narrative complexity when they also choose higher fees. And we also have some additional analyses. Even though I just showed you those specific disclosures, perhaps you're still thinking that something might be causing both the high fees and the high complexity. And we look at 2 SEC regulations in 2009, and we do a pre-post test. So the idea is with these SEC regulations, which introduced the summary section, funds should be motivated to clean up their disclosures. And we do find that post 2010, the funds with the greatest complexity, the greatest narrative complexity pre-2010, actually clean up their disclosures the most. And that tells us that this narrative complexity is likely discretionary. It's a choice for funds because they can clean them up. It also lends some construct validity to our proxies of narrative complexity. And then also these regulations also should have reduced information costs for investors, thus decreasing the effectiveness of any obfuscation strategy. And so we also find evidence consistent with the Carlin 2009 model, that mechanism, because after 2010, when the regulations became effective, the investment in high fee funds was reduced. We also have some additional analyses. We look at possible other alternative explanations, such as investor horizon, marketing, other complementary strategies, as well as whether or not this might be a parent level strategy and whether parents might be offering other services or benefits when they also have high fees. So just to summarize what I've talked about, what we study in this paper is strategic obfuscation in S&P 500 index funds. And this holds constant the risks, gross returns, and regulations. And we find that unnecessary complexity in disclosures and fee structures persists despite decades of regulation. And we find this even in specific disclosures free from the effects of structural complexity. Now, our contributions are not just to the mutual funds literature, but also in informing ongoing regulation to improve fund disclosures, including something that we just put in a comment for the 2020 proposed rule. And we also contribute to the literature on corporate disclosure readability, which has found mixed evidence when it comes to obfuscation. So thank you everyone for your attention this morning. And Roger, I look forward to your insightful discussion.
Thank you, Christina. And now Roger Edelin from Virginia Tech will discuss the paper. And Christina, that was a very nice job. Thank you. Roger?
Okay, so let me get this screen share. So are we good there? Okay, so first of all, let me start off with thanking Michelle. She nailed my name, which is like about a 1.5% probability. Most people call me Roger Edelin. It's actually Edelin. Thank you. More generally, let me join all the other authors and discussants in thanking the editors and the JAE for inviting me to this discussion. I really appreciate it and am honored and agree with all the other discussants on that point. Okay, so this question of obfuscation and mutual fund really falls into a category that I've long been interested in with mutual funds, which is to veer away from the standard focus on sort of mean variance performance in the portfolio and start to look at mutual funds in the context of what they really are, which is a financial product that has many dimensions beyond simply the return performance. So I really was grateful to have the opportunity to look at this paper, and I think it's a very interesting paper for that reason. Okay, so I am going to look at a few discussion points here. The first thing that I want to do is kind of put the paper in the literature. You know, what do we know? What do we not know? As many of you are probably familiar with the S&P 500, although it's a very simple beast, this S&P 500 index funds, there's actually an awful lot of literature on these papers. And so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what we already know about these guys and then how the current paper fits into that. I will then give a brief little discussion about the notion of sort of this plain English disclosure and more generally disclosures in a prospectus and how we might interpret the intent of that disclosure. And then finally, a couple of methodological points. Okay, so what do we know? What do we not know? Well, first of all, one thing that we know is the answer to this question. Do financial consumers lapse in evaluating quality? So this is a question that's often obfuscated by complexity of the product, but there's a lot of understanding in this notion, consumer finance, about whether this complexity and quality differences plays out. And one of the interesting results is in the banking and credit card market. So Stango and Zinman have a series of papers that I think are quite interesting on this front, worth looking at. It's not mutual funds, but it does speak to this general question of, in consumer finance, do we see this lapse in quality? And they look at credit cards and installment loans and this kind of thing, and show that there's some really remarkable cases where they do. And this, both the salience and the clarity of the disclosure can really matter. So we know in that sector it matters. More generally in mutual funds, which of course are parsed into active and passive funds, there's a lot of results that show that expenses do predict returns. And we know, going back to Jensen in '68, that mutual funds generally underperform on a net basis. A lot of that underperformance is in fact generated by the expenses. Malkiel has a very nice study that looks at the expense impact on performance. But most important to this study, he decomposes the expense ratio into a sort of advisor component, you know, the operational parts of the portfolio management, and a distribution component. And what he finds is that the distribution component entirely accounts for the relation between fees and performance. In fact, the advisor fee, meaning the payment that's actually made to design and manage the portfolio, is actually slightly positively related to performance, though not significantly. So let's call it zero. But all of the detrimental effect of expenses is in distribution. And that's going to be a point that I'm going to emphasize multiple times in this talk. It's a very central point to this paper. And I also point out, which again, I'll relate to later, but there's a very interesting, perhaps conflict here in that marketing expenses are the only expenses that hurt performance, and marketing expenses work. They are have a very high impact on the inflows into a fund. Paradoxically, from a consumer finance point of view, or quality, if you define quality as return performance, then these distribution fees are certainly working against quality. Now, that's with the broader market of active funds. Passive funds are quite a bit more interesting, as Christina has pointed out, and many other studies have pointed out, making the S&P 500 index fund a very studied, attractive subject to look at, because they are extremely simple. There's very little discretion. And for these reasons, we would expect that things like quality differences, which are pretty much defined in terms of the performance of the fund. However, with an S&P 500 fund, the performance is really defined by expenses. In fact, Elton, Gruber, and Bussey showed that the expenses explain about 75% of the performance difference. The coefficient is like 0.999. It's just an exact one-for-one relation between expenses and quality, if we think of quality as being return performance. Moreover, they show, and others have shown, that, as Christina referred to, in this product, it's very simple, very exacting product, the differential fees can be enormous, absolutely outstanding, and yet the different funds survive. Now, why do they survive? Well, again, because most of the heterogeneity in fees is due to distribution. And as Malkiel has shown, distribution is where the performance hit is coming. But unfortunately, the reality is distribution works. There's an old saying in the industry that mutual funds are not bought, they're sold. And that seems to be the case, even in a fund as simple as a S&P 500 index fund. Okay, so do financial consumers lapse in evaluating quality? I believe the answer is yes. And does it relate to non-return dimensions of quality? Well, this question here is one of three questions relating to why this might be the case, that they lapse in evaluating quality. First of all, it may be that, well, we haven't really defined quality correctly. We're talking about returns, but there may be other dimensions that matter. The other thing that could matter is, again, this distribution dimension. And the final thing that could matter, which is what the current paper is looking at, is disclosure. Perhaps it is the fact that the consumers aren't really aware of the differential quality. And indeed, perhaps the industry or the funds per se don't mind sort of pushing that obfuscation in order to make sure that they continue their state of unknowing about the quality. But before we get to the obfuscation issue, let's make sure we sort of lay out the background as far as what we do know. So this notion of other dimensions of quality, I personally believe that this may or may not be a bit of a stretch, but nevertheless, it has been shown in several studies that another dimension of quality that we might think about is the diversity of offerings, sort of the smorgasbord or the menu at the family. Because there's a lot of evidence, and the way distribution fees work is the distribution fees apply to the family, not the fund, but the family. And there's sort of like a one-stop shopping issue here that could be regarded as a dimension of quality. So if an S&P 500 index fund is in fact embedded within a family that gives you an offering of 30, 40 other diverse funds that gives you your broad portfolio without having to sort of shop at other families, then maybe that's sort of a hidden dimension of quality that could be at play here. And Corona and surveys show that in the broad market. Another dimension of quality is financial advice and planning. Now, this is an important distinction. In mutual funds, that pay a distribution fee. The distribution fee, of course, largely goes to a financial consultant, planner, advisor, broker, whatever you want to call it, but basically a salesperson. And there's some advertising, but most of it is sort of payment for distribution. And you could argue that that's actually a bundling of payments. So when I pay the fees on a advisor class fund, I'm paying for portfolio management, but I'm also paying for advice. And Berg, Stresser, Chalmers, and Tofano look at that from a variety of different approaches and basically find little evidence that we can define the quality difference in terms of sort of this nebulous overarching advice from the consultant. I think that could be debated, but that's sort of the point. So long and short of it is we do know that there are these other dimensions of quality that matter, but what about passive funds? I mean, again, a passive fund, S&P 500 fund is as plain vanilla as you can get. Does it apply here? Well, other studies have shown that yes, indeed, this notion of sort of a family offering really does seem to come into play in terms of explaining why do investors seek out certain funds that have much higher fees and therefore much lower returns, when in fact, the product itself is arguably indistinguished. You know, the actual return differences on a growth level tend to be microscopic, measured in basis points. So again, it does seem like there are these other dimensions of quality which could explain the heterogeneity in fees and survival of high fee funds. And then another question, which I think is extremely important to this paper, and I'll get to the link that I think is the key contribution of this paper in a moment. But the issue here is, do intermediaries distort the choice of consumers? And I've alluded to this earlier. The basic notion here is, you know, are mutual funds sold or are they bought? And the idea there is, I'm going to push something on you that may not be in your interest, but it does get me income as a salesperson. So one aspect of this is to look at marketing expenses and whether they drive flows. And there's plenty of evidence that shows that they do. You know, again, marketing expenses work. And interestingly enough, that applies again to passive funds as well. So Elton, Gruber, and Bussey have shown that this is a primary explanation for flows into S&P 500 funds. And in fact, it does relate to this distribution channel. So do advisors distort consumer choice? Absolutely. And I might stop for a moment about this question of distort. Well, distort would be a contorted word if the quality difference wasn't there, but we already know quite clearly from Elton, Gruber, and Bussey that the return performance of these choices that the clients of an advisor make, in other words, advisor class S&P 500 funds, those returns are far worse. So they are indeed, I would argue, distorting choice. Okay, so does salience matter? And this to me, like I say, this is kind of the backdrop for this paper. Now we're sort of getting to the point of the paper is, does salience matter and do producers intentionally obfuscate? Here again, there is actually a background in this subject. And these papers I list here are more quantitative in the analysis of salience and obfuscation. What I mean by that is they're looking at the structure of the fee. So Barbara Odine and Zhang show that the explicit salience of a fee, like a load fee, is, they argue, is in your face, a 5% charge right up front that makes it very clear that you're losing money to pay for distribution. Conversely, a 12B1 fee is baked into the expense ratio, drawn from the assets of the fund, and therefore, at least structurally speaking, sort of harder to detect. Our paper, Edelin, Evans, and Cadlock looked at soft dollars. Bador, Costello, James have a recent paper that looks at retirement funds and how the retirement platform can choose the family of funds that they go with. And there's sort of this revenue sharing, sort of this under the table passing of fees back and forth between the decision maker and the fee collector. So all of these papers show that, yes, there does seem to be this intentional obfuscation at the structural level. How do they actually structure the payment? Okay, but that's not what this paper is looking at. This paper is looking at the explicit narrative disclosure in the official document, the prospectus of the fund. And I think that's a very interesting, novel contribution that the literature has not really gone into. So I'll call this a question mark. This we don't really know, and we don't really have a lot of evidence on this, and is the major contribution of this paper. Okay, so just to summarize this first discussion point, how do we frame the paper's contribution? Well, I don't really believe that the statement that there's heterogeneity in a simple product with respect to performance, and it relates to fees, and nevertheless consumers buy it, I don't think that's a particularly novel result. That's been shown very clearly. And again, it's also been shown very clearly that it relates to a very simple statement. Distribution works. Mutual funds are sold. They're not bought. And then the second statement here is this notion of obfuscation by the fund, again, getting at this narrative point here. Because I think that narrative dimension is really extremely interesting. As Christina pointed out, funds can choose to obfuscate their fees by way of soft dollars, other sort of structural arrangements. But here's a choice where we can really sort of examine their behavior in terms of their narrative statements and see, do they seem to be doing this kind of by intent? And one thing I want to emphasize, what I find most fascinating about this paper, most provocative and most interesting, is the link between where the obfuscation occurs in the narration and the advisor class funds. And in particular, I sort of phrase it here as a need for justification for the financial advisor. So the financial advisor, of course, collects fees to educate a consumer or guide a fearful consumer through this process of investment. They obviously have an interest in maintaining that fear and maintaining that uncertainty for the consumer. What this paper seems to point out is that there seems to be a very clear link between the needs of the financial advisor to sort of justify their existence and the efforts of the fund, which is, after all, a separate entity, the efforts of the fund to support that need by way of this sort of Carlin model, notion of intentional obfuscation. And again, I think that's a very interesting component of this paper. Okay, point number two, or subject number two, is plain English and prospectus intent. Okay, so it is indeed the case that the SEC has been quite focused on plain English for a long time. And you could argue, here's an example. This is, of course, taken directly from the paper. One S&P 500 stated their description of the fund as the goal is to track the S&P 500. Couldn't be more clear and easy to read. Another fund, this would be Deutsche, says that blah, 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 this entire long-winded discussion. So it's just readily apparent which one is easier to read. And dating back to 1998, well, of course, before that, as they were developing the regulation, but since 1998, the SEC has mandated that disclosure needs to be readable and clear. And this is a very recent example, long past 1998, where that's not necessarily the case. So there's no question that there's this heterogeneity in disclosure. However, I want to point out that it's not entirely obvious that the sole motive here is malice and obfuscation. Case in point, it's entirely plausible. I know what the S&P 500 index is. I'm sure everyone in this audience knows what the S&P 500 index is, but it's entirely plausible that some of these consumers literally do not know what the index is, what's the reason that we have such an index, and indeed, is the index even equities or bonds or what? So depending on the actual level of knowledge here, it's plausible that this second disclosure is actually more descriptive, more informative, more to the point. You're investing in common stocks. You're doing it for capital appreciation. The focus is not income, et cetera. So you could argue that the second disclosure is actually more to the point as far as what the SEC wants the illiterate financial consumer to be told, although it does take more words. And the second point that I think is pretty much never mentioned in this literature, unfortunately, but let's recognize that the fund prospectus is a legal document. And this is not the first case of a legal document using legalese and speaking in these lofty, convoluted terms. And one purpose for that could, of course, be to intentionally obfuscate. Another purpose for legalese might be to provide a very exacting defense in case something goes wrong. So, for example, disclosing that you have expenses, disclosing that you are investing in common stocks, disclosing that your objective is capital appreciation, not income, provides legal defense for the fund family. The first disclosure says that you track the S&P 500, does not provide that legal defense. And so I think this notion of communication may be misguided. I think the purpose of a prospectus might alternatively be to provide legal cover. And so that's something that I want to consider. And the point here is that, you know, as well, we all know that courts operate based on precedents. And when you're using standard boilerplate legalese, one thing about that is the judge knows exactly what you're saying and exactly how to interpret that. The client may not, but in fact, it's the judge that may be that the prospectus is targeted for. Okay, so again, it's not entirely clear that the intent is obfuscation. It could be a more legal, you know, trying to reduce their legal costs. Okay, and another point along this front, sort of related, strategic obfuscation. Well, okay, so here's, I guess this is Market Watch. You know, there's dozens of websites that will tell you about differential fees. And we see down here, you know, here's your turnover, here's your expense ratio, et cetera. It's really not hard to get the information that you need, which entirely determines the performance of an S&P 500 fund. So the degree to which this is unclear is, you know, I'm not so sure about it. SEC disclosure, I think the authors have a wonderful example here pointing out the difference between these two. And, you know, having one quick look at this, it's just no question that there is obfuscation here. Okay, and so that's, again, you know, I think it's there, but I'm not really sure that the consumer is so obfuscated. Then again, maybe they're not aware of financial websites. I'm not sure. Methodology, there's a couple of points I want to make here. I know I'm running out of time, but really briefly, one of the primary dimensions they use is a multi-fund prospectus. The purpose here, I don't really think the purpose here is obfuscation. Mutual funds file by way of a series. A series is one mutual fund with multiple portfolios. It's one company. The mutual fund is a company. And they do that simply to lower their legal costs. You know, I used to work with a fund, and that's just a clear dimension here. It's just to lower your legal cost. So this may not be intentional obfuscation. Other points about the measures, I have concern with repetition. You know, if they say that their goal is to track the S&P 500 twice, you know, I'm not sure how confusing that is. And then the final point that I want to make here is with regard to this structural complexity point. So structural complexity, a lot of the measures they use, these are precisely indicators for a broker sold fund. And so when you take this structural complexity measure, what you're really doing is just saying, this is a broker sold S&P 500 fund. And we already know that broker sold funds, A, have higher fees because of course they're paying the broker, B, they have much worse performance. And so to come up with this principal components of these measures and say, here's my measure for this, you know, I think this is just isomorphic to saying it's a broker sold fund. and we already know that that's going to harm the performance. So what I think is more interesting in this paper is to focus on that link between disclosure obfuscation and indeed the class of fund you're talking about, the fact that the distribution channel uses advisors, and explore this symbiosis between the fund and their obfuscation and the advisor and their need to have a confused client. Okay, so again, I'm out of time, so let me just finish really quick. I think this is a very novel and insightful expansion of what we know about mutual funds. I think that the positioning in the literature is probably more important. They could do a little bit more with that. However, I think this exploration of the explicit narrative dimension is very important. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. That was excellent. Christina, would you like a couple minutes to respond?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Michelle. And Roger, thank you so much for all those really insightful comments. I really appreciate that you took the time to help us improve the paper and for the audience help to put the paper in the literature. So you've given us a lot to think about. I just want to build on one of your points, which is what the contribution of the paper is. We certainly didn't mean to imply that we are the first to look at structural complexity. As you noted, a lot of the literature in finance has done work on structural complexity on those broker sold funds. We actually thought about whether or not we wanted to write a paper solely on the narrative complexity piece, only looking at those prospectus disclosures, because as accountants, we are interested in disclosure, right? A lot of the accounting literature has looked at disclosure incentives, impacts of disclosure, but then we thought we'd also include the structural complexity piece to just be more complete. I do think that we can be clearer about the contribution of the narrative complexity piece in our paper. So thanks for helping us place it in the literature. We can definitely do a lot more work in the paper and the writing on that front. Also, you know, a lot of these alternative stories that you raised, such as legalese, validating that investors actually do attempt to read these prospectuses. We do a lot of that work in the design of our tests. Some of that is in the online appendix, and the online appendix, let's talk about length. It's 50 pages long. You know, I wouldn't expect anyone in the audience to have to go through a 50-page online appendix. Perhaps we should bring some of that into the main paper. So I'm happy to address more questions during the Q&A. Again, thank you so much, Roger. That was really helpful.
All right, great, thank you. So we'll start with the Q&A, Partha, and try to keep them brief both ways if we can.
Thanks a lot, Michelle. Christina, great paper, great presentation, and a wonderful discussion as well. My question is very, very basic. Why would you expect, you know, retail investors to actually read these prospectuses? And why wouldn't a simple, you know, thing that almost everyone does, a Google search? I mean, while you were presenting, I just did a Google search on what are the cheapest S&P 500 index funds. And it actually gave me the answers and actually told me that Fidelity is actually the cheapest. It's 1.5 basis points and Schwab is at 2 basis points. So why wouldn't they just simply do that? And rather than, you know, this notion that these individual investors are actually reading these thick prospectuses and focusing on that language and then making a decision seems a little far-fetched to me.
Yeah, well, Partha, thank you for the question. So, you know, basic answer to your basic question is that you seem to be an informed investor. So in the Carlin 2009 model, the informed investor is very easily determines the fees that he or she must pay, but the uninformed investor cannot even determine the fees that he or she must pay. So this would be, you know, not reading prospectuses, not actually even Googling for that, would be consistent with the Carlin 2009 model.
But if they're not reading the prospectus, how can you argue that they are being confused with the complex language in the prospectus? Because you can't have it both ways. You can't say that they are they are not reading the prospectus, but at the same time you're saying that they're confused with the complex language, right? There's a disconnect there.
Well, personally, if I'm confused by something, I find something to be very complex, that means that I don't even want to go and read it. But again, I'm saying this is an informed audience, right? So there is a lot of survey evidence. The SEC has done surveys of investors that say that, you know, most investors do attempt to read the prospectus, and a lot of them actually determine that they can't figure out the prospectus. Now, to your point that, you know, they're not even reading the prospectus, we also do some work in the paper to see whether investors might be confused by prospectus complexity, even if they're not directly reading the prospectus. So what we do in the paper is we look at 4 top brokerage sites, and we look at whether or not those brokerages copy and paste language from the prospectus. And we find that nearly all of those brokerages and nearly all of our funds, that investment objective section is completely copied and pasted exactly from the prospectus. So even if investors don't read prospectus disclosures directly, they're still going to be impacted by that complexity.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Raul?
Interesting, a super interesting paper. Again, a very simple question. Seems like a direct implication of your story is that ownership at more complex funds should be dominated by retail investors, basically, right? And not sophisticated institutional clients. Is it not possible to directly examine this in data? So for example, using things like what fraction of assets of the funds are owned by retail share classes or institutional share classes? Maybe that's a noisy way, but is there any way to do this? Seems like a very direct ask.
So Rahul, I'll say one thing in response to your comment that you think that more retail investors should be in more complex funds. We're actually only looking at retail investors. So we're holding that constant and only looking at retail investors. Now, I agree with you that the least sophisticated retail investors should be in the more complex funds. That would be what would be predicted by the model. It's hard for us to kind of determine like an observable measure of who is the most sophisticated retail investor, because what we see in the data is simply retail institutional.
All right.
Okay, Henry has his hand up next, and you probably have noticed that Ed is typing responses furiously in the chat box as well. So Henry, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think there's been a lot of discussion and a lot of focus on the role that investment managers play or advisors, and because of that, I was curious if it seems like you dismissed ETFs pretty quickly in one of the footnotes, but that seems like a setting where investment advisors, kickbacks, things like that would play a much smaller role. So isn't that a setting where disclosures to retail investors would potentially be the most important or the cleanest relative to some of these alternative explanations? And related to that, I know your sample ends in 2017, but it seems like you could, if you were able to extend it to 2018 or 2019, you could use like Robinhood, RobinTrack data to look at retail holdings of S&P ETFs and how those vary by fees, basically. That would seem to be a straightforward way of getting at whether this sort of thing would potentially matter.
Yeah, so I haven't been looking at the chat, but as Roger mentioned in his very nice discussion, there is a big effect of these brokers, right? Are they broker sold funds? Now, for our funds, the reason why we can't look at ETFs is that ETFs have this arbitrage mechanism, right? They're traded on the open market, whereas the mechanism for mutual funds is based on that Carlin 2009 model simplified, right? So we can't really look at ETFs in order to see whether this might be going on. ETFs don't have loads, as you mentioned, which would go to the marketing of the brokers. Another thing that I will mention, which is kind of like a broader point, is that just because funds can be sold by brokers, it doesn't mean that obfuscation in the prospectus disclosures isn't also going on, right? These could be complementary strategies. I like what Roger said about the symbiosis. That's very much probably what's going on. So it really doesn't make sense to isolate, kind of try to find a setting where there are no brokers when funds do these two things together. So our strategy to isolate the strategic obfuscation through narrative disclosures is to look at disclosures that should be completely unaffected by marketing, by brokers, instead of trying to find a setting which really doesn't exist, where brokers wouldn't have an effect.
Okay, Charles Lee.
Okay, thank you. Great fun, wonderful paper, fantastic discussion. I think this is really cool. I'm learning a lot. So I think most of us would be surprised at the degree of heterogeneity across both funds and disclosures for something as simple as an index fund like S&P 500. So the interesting question is how can this be in equilibrium, right? So how is it that we can have such a wide range on something that's obviously commoditizable or easily commoditized? And I think a very important piece, and Roger pointed that out too, is sort of the distributional channels for these investment index funds, right? And so I think that if you look down that road, you'll find that a lot of these distributions are done at the family level. So employers will decide. So I don't get to pick between Schwab and Deutsche because Stanford's already decided for me. Fortunately, they didn't pick Deutsche, but so to some extent, the reason why you have all these different index funds is because there are all these institutions who have made a platform decision to keep that family. And so when you think in terms of platforms, a lot of things start to emerge. For example, cross-subsidy of funds. Deutsche is very expensive, but maybe Deutsche does a whole bunch of things for your employer that the other, maybe you have a wider range, you got a whole bunch of other things. So you won't see that. But the funds not only are sold, they're sold in families. ETFs are different because ETF is commoditized. You sell and buy like a stock. You won't get that structure. And the other thing about sort of the family level clustering is also, I think you probably see disclosure also clustered at the family level in terms of the language and type of things. And I think Dan pointed that out so I think you'll see some of that. None of this take away from what you've done. I think this is a super cool paper because I think that when we think financial, we don't think marketing. And the other thing I would observe is why, so the pushback, if you sell everything at the fund level, at the family level, the pushback is why don't I object if my employer is using an expensive fund? Why don't I raise crap and why don't I? And I think this is one reason why you have obfuscation. You try to reduce the level of noise and friction to sort of point where the typical investor is not busy yelling at the employer for doing a stupid thing and doing me wrong. So I think that it's not only just a matter of us reading prospectuses, it's the fact that we're just sort of more oblivious to this cross-subsidying going on and the fact that I end up paying for it. So all of that I think is really cool and speaks to, I think, the contribution of the paper.
Yeah, Charles, thank you so much for that. And I also want to mention that, Charles, I actually didn't, it was your PhD seminar where you showed us this, this packet of all the different fees of ETFs and mutual funds that actually made me aware that there could even be different fees for really simple entities. So thank you for that. Yeah, I agree with you. A lot of this is done at the family level. There's a lot of complexity in the retirement savings of your institution. I'm glad to hear that Stanford has chosen some cheap funds for you. Of course, as you mentioned, right, that's not the subject of our paper, where we're not looking at institutional share classes. We're looking at the self-directed retirement savings or self-directed funds. But even in those retirement savings that are chosen by the institution, prior literature has shown that people tend to just randomly allocate across all of the funds offered by your employer. And maybe they only offer 4 funds, but then you'll choose to put 1/4 of your investment in each of those 4 funds. So even though the Carlin model and what we're doing here is not specifically looking at those institutions, that still can have an effect. And then one other thing that you mentioned, which I think it's a good segue for me to actually show one of the results, which I didn't get to in the presentation, is that complexity is a parent level strategy. So what I'm showing here is complexity a parent level strategy? Yes. So when we look at the parent level, the family level, we do see that the length of the expense disclosure, the words per sentence of the expense disclosure for all of the funds under the parent are positively correlated with the parent level fees. Now, of course, this setting isn't as tight as the S&P 500 index fund setting, but it does speak to some of what you talked about in your comment.
Okay, Sugata.
Okay, so thank you, Michelle. So two quick comments, and both of them have to do with what Roger said earlier. The first one is about the legalese, and that was one of my first thoughts as well. And I think it's an excellent point. But if you think about, how many times do you think Deutsche Bank has been sued versus Charles Schwab? I asked my PhD students this, and all of them said Deutsche Bank. So it might actually be possible empirically to do something about this fairly easily. You can look at their litigation histories, and you can look at the size of their legal counsel, etc., their legal team. The second thing that I want to say is, having read these papers like Hartascu and Severson, what is not clear is what are the limits to endogenizing the extent to which investors are uninformed, right? So what are the limits to mutual funds' abilities to endogenize that? And on top of that, can you keep bringing uninformed investors into the market? And I think your paper, this link between complexity and marketing might be interesting and intriguing because it gives you the limits, like to what extent can firms spend on pushing their products. And so the ones that are simple may be that they are the ones that cannot make it complex enough because they have either decided or don't have the resources to spend on marketing. So that may be a significant area of contribution for your paper.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Sagata. So, first point, which is the point that Roger brought up about the legalese, I agree with you. Deutsche Bank has been sued more than Schwab. In terms of legalese, though, when I think about the prospectus being a legal document, well, it is a legal document. I completely agree with you. But it's also a legal document whose contents are regulated and enforced by the SEC. So that's why we use measures that are designed or motivated by SEC comments to actually figure out, are they creating more complex disclosures? For example, the number of funds in the filing, as well as the repetition between the summary and the details section. That's something that the SEC would say, hey, that makes things really complex. And we can actually, we determine that it's hard for investors to determine the fees they must pay if you make things so complex. And that's the legal risk there, that they made things too complex, right? But we do design measures, right, that are free from those effects, like looking specifically at the investment objective disclosure should be free from the effects of legalese. Again, that summary section is, we're holding constant the total amount of information in the prospectus. The summary section is just the synthesis of the information that's in the details. And then to your other point about, can we actually investigate the limits of this strategy, right? Like how far can they push it? I agree with you and what Roger said about looking at marketing and the complexity of the disclosures together. And we do find some of that, right? That both it's not part of our main analysis, but the marketing aspect and the complexity of the disclosure, those are very much correlated, right? So you would think that it is a complementary strategy. And then one other thing I'll say to that point is that, like, what are the limits to this thing? Well, we can actually see that, with the SEC really focused on investor education, focused on improving these disclosures, we do see some evidence that, this strategy becomes less effective. Right. So as you kind of make those disclosures more readable, it's very likely that investors are reducing their investment in high fee funds.
Thank you.
Joao Granja.
So my comment and suggestion basically relates to what Shugada says. Seems to me like there's a huge endogeneity here in that, some SAP funds will sort of be more exposed to unsophisticated financial consumers. They will probably, and so to me, what is not clear is this disclosure strategy and obfuscation a sort of a side effect of this, or is it really the case that if you basically take away their ability to obfuscate, will they sort of lose? They will have to pool with the other S&P funds and basically practice lower prices. And in that, if this is where you want to get at, I think we need a little bit more, quasi-experimental evidence to support that hypothesis, right? I mean, and the evidence that we have available from the other consumer financial products is not very supportive of the idea that better disclosures would basically prompt consumers to switch. Like if you look at Chris Palmer's paper that is forthcoming in JFE, in which they randomize the salience and the standardization of the consumer financial disclosures, they find very little effects. Also, there's papers on the AJ applied. They basically also randomize information on credit card disclosures. They find that consumers also tend to not react to those, the shape of the disclosures that are being done. So I wonder how, if we basically shock these mutual funds to do it differently. I mean, are we really going to find different effects in this market? So that would be, I mean, and these will be the most, like, from a policy standpoint, that will be sort of the million-dollar question, right? We definitely need to know whether like doing something about disclosure, it would be a policy that will tend to push consumers to better decisions.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Joao. So thank you also for giving us those citations. We'll certainly take a look at some literature that shows that disclosure doesn't quite matter in those settings. In our setting, we're not necessarily testing for the effects of the disclosure of the obfuscation. Now, of course, that would be consistent with the model, right? The model says that because of all this complexity must have an effect on retail investors. Otherwise, you wouldn't see that this strategic obfuscation would be going on. So what I've put on this on my shared screen once again is what we're testing, which is the outcomes of the strategy. Low fees along with simple disclosures and fee structures, high fees along with complex disclosures and fee structures. And then what you're talking about here is like, are some funds just more exposed to more retail investors? I would categorize that as the strategic manager choosing which of those strategies to engage in. And that's something that we can't observe. Sorry, that's the part that I did not circle in red, right? Whether or not they choose the complex strategy or the simple strategy might be determined by something else. But the findings of our paper show that this positive correlation does exist, which does show that there is strategic obfuscation going on. Of course, we can't necessarily say which funds will be doing which. And then to your last point about can we investigate the effects? I do want to say that a lot of the disclosure literature has looked at strategic disclosure without investigating the effects, and that I would put our paper in that category. We're looking at strategic obfuscation. We're not looking at the effects. One of the reasons is, as you mentioned, the endogeneity problem is hard. It's really hard to hold constant everything else, marketing, for example, and the brokers, in order to investigate the effect of disclosure. Now, I think this is where structural can play a role. One of my colleagues in Wharton Finance has a structural approach to estimate the effect of marketing. I think that is a good route to take. That's not what we're doing in our paper because we're not looking at the effects. But that being said, we do have some, a little bit of evidence using a regulatory shock, right? Using the 2009 SEC regulations, which introduced the summary sections. And we do see that does have an effect, right? It's hard to hold constant everything else, but we have some preliminary evidence there that investors actually do reduce their investment in high complexity funds when those funds clean up those disclosures.
Okay, great. We have 3 more questions and 5 more minutes. So if we can keep them tight, that would be great. Schumann, Martin.
Yeah, very interesting paper. So my question is related with Charles' comment about, if this distribution channel is done at the employer level rather than employee level, then I wonder if you thought about the implication about financial, the policy implication about the financial education, because if the parent is doing the best to maximize the value of the employer, then no matter what it does, it wouldn't maximize the individual employee's return, right? So, and that's where the financial education to the employee probably matters, to make them aware of this. And yeah, so this, I think this kind of a discussion might help about the policy implication.
Yeah, I think I'm glad that you brought that up about the policy implications, because what we have done in our paper is talk through some of the regulatory implications for the producer side, right, which is the mutual funds making more clear disclosures. But perhaps, even though it's not the subject of our study, as I mentioned to Charles, that we're not looking at the employers, right, any of the funds that are offered just by employers, we're looking at the retail share classes only. Perhaps there is also some policy implication, not just for the producers of these disclosures, but also the consumers of these disclosures, right? As you mentioned, the investor education piece could be really important as well. Yeah, so thank you for adding that.
Phil Stockin.
Not unrelated. You're assuming that ceteris paribus, that service is equally distributed across these funds, but these funds do differ along that dimension. And are they not using the heightened complexity to signal that they're a low-cost provider or a quality service provider? And so are you not just capturing the fact that these higher fee funds are just providing a higher level of service to their investors?
Okay, so I guess, so I'm trying to think through what you're saying. So the idea is that some of the high fee funds could be offering more benefits or services to their clients, right? That increases the fees. If we take a look at our regression, perhaps they want to discuss those other services in the prospectus. Therefore, that is like a correlated omitted variable, right? That could cause both the higher complexity and the higher fees. We did think about this. So the idea is that, we do want to focus on the disclosures that should be free from the effects of those other services that are offered by the parent, right? They're not discussing those other services in those specific disclosures, the equity risk section, the investment objective section. But we also, we also share your concern, right? Maybe what we're capturing here isn't some discretionary fee. It's some fee that's offered for other benefits, other services. The prior literature in finance finds that this customer service is not really a benefit for investors. But we did want to investigate descriptively whether in our sample, we do see any differences across the other services offered by these parents. So what I will show you now is what we did is that we looked at all of the parents for in our sample, and we ranked them from the lowest to highest, and we tabulated the other services offered. Now, of course, this is only the observable services offered. We can't observe things that are unobservable. And we find that there really isn't much of a difference between the services offered by the parent and the fees, right? So if we take a look at, what am I going to show you here? I'm going to show you a number of other services. So that last row right there, if we actually look at the difference between the high fee funds and the low fee funds, we don't really see much of a difference between the other services offered by those funds.
No, this is not what I have in mind. This is a situation where they assign you a financial advisor, and you can dial that financial advisor directly versus being put in a pool and getting an email occasionally. So there's a quality of service that they're offering, not in terms of the, where they offer you insurance or etc., but the quality of the service that you get when you're trying to decide whether to invest, how much to invest, what funds you should be investing, and so on.
Okay, so being able to call up your advisor versus emailing them. Yeah, so that's not something, I'm not aware of a data source that would allow us to tabulate that. But then I would go back to my second point, which is that, we do look at disclosures that should be free from the effects of those, customer service, being able to call your broker or call the fund itself. And so even in those disclosures, you don't see you don't see that, or we do see that the high fee funds have longer disclosures, more complex disclosures, even though those disclosures are not talking about the other benefits.
Okay, so Charles, if you can have a very quick comment, and probably if Christina, you can respond to him later, that would be fine. But Charles, if you want to go ahead.
Okay, sounds great. So really fast, on the evidence that Joao said, you need to go look at some experimental evidence. I'd say that's kind of, it supports to some degree, but oftentimes the complexity that the investor is looking at is not like the kind of things that was done in these other papers where basically marketing. If you put a transparent gamble in front of somebody, they're not going to be stupid enough to pick one versus the other. Whereas here we have something, I think, all you have to do is create sufficient friction so that you don't go and complain to whoever made the platform decision, whoever made the parent family decision. And so I don't think any of those papers would actually necessarily predict that what you're finding, which is the sort of complexity being correlated with the fee. So anyway, I'll shut up.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you to Ed, Yang, Chloe, and Christina for the paper. It's excellent. Thank you, Roger, for the discussion. Great job, Ed, Herculean effort on the chat box. And we will come back in 10 minutes and have the second paper. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone, for the comments.
Okay, so I think we should all be back now. It's time to start, 11:26. So all of the other moderators have done a fine job. So I'm the last person to can screw something up, and it may well happen, but hopefully not. So this is our last session. We have, I think it's going to be an interesting one. It's an interesting paper. Paper's titled "The Economic Consequences of Mandatory Auditor Reporting to Bank Supervisors." Emmanuel DeGeorge is going to talk about the paper, and then Mary Barth will discuss it. So Emmanuel, roughly 20 minutes or so.
Perfect, thanks. All right, let me share the screen. Did that work?
It did, yeah. There was some background noise, so I muted everybody. Now you're unmuted. Good to go.
All right, and you can see the everyone sees the lecture slides?
Yep.
Perfect. All right, so firstly, obviously, I'd like to thank the conference organizers for the chance to present the paper here. It's the last paper of the conference and of the day, so hopefully you guys find it as interesting as we did in writing it. We'll also thank Mary and Amir too in advance. So this is joint work with Karthik and Aitakan and Hannah Scobie, who's from the European Economics and Financial Centre and based in London. So, all right. So before we get into it, given we had a lot of input from regulators and supervisors for this paper, we just want to be clear that the views here are our own and not necessarily the institutions or the individual regulators in the study. So before I get into the research question, I want to take a step back and just provide some background and broad motivation for what we're trying to do here. So following the financial crisis, there was increased calls to improve auditor communication with bank regulators. And this was very interesting actually to us and seemed like something that was sort of new and uncharted territory, especially as back in the day, I had some audit experience, never really thought about the auditor's role in bank supervision. So this actually prompted the Basel Committee to update their previous guidance on what is an effective relationship between a bank supervisor and a bank's external auditor. So in their updated guidelines, they set forth sort of supervisory expectations on the principles pertaining to these interactions, and two principles sort of stuck out as quite interesting. So in one of them, they spoke of the supervisor and the auditor having an effective relationship with appropriate communication channels for the exchange of information. And then in another one, they mentioned that the auditor, and this one was very surprising, should require the supervisor should require the external auditor to report to it directly on any matters that are likely to be material significance to the function of the supervisor. So this was an explicit call for bringing the auditor very much into the supervisory process. And when you read their reasoning, it's sort of predicated on the notion that the auditors, they can provide assurance, verification on the inputs of the regulatory ratios. They have a unique understanding of the business. They're probably, quite intertwined with the bank operations, given their substantive work to understand the control and IT systems. So this is all information that could be beneficial for a supervisor to do their job a little better. Now, at the same time, during the consultative process of the guidelines, this was met with some opposition. So we had practitioners and professional bodies argue that this would be costly with little benefit. And in particular, they sort of went down the route of, look, this could be just over-regulation. So what you're going to have is just a slowdown in bank activities. There's going to be a bunch of upfront costs. You're putting the auditor in a very difficult position, given privacy and confidentiality concerns. Because now, again, remember, we're talking about direct communication and reporting channels between a supervisor and an auditor about an audit client. And moreover, there was arguments made that the auditor may not bring much to the table in terms of useful information, given the differing objectives of what an auditor is looking at when they're going out there providing assurance versus what the supervisors sort of care about, right? And auditors are going to audit to scope. So given that, we sort of wanted to know to what extent these mandates were put in national regulation, if they were, right? We just want to get an idea about the extent of auditor involvement in supervision, because relatively little was known. And then given the cost and benefits that were mentioned, we wanted to get an idea about sort of the efficacy of the mandates. So this brings us to the research question, the objective of the study, which is what are the economic consequences of this sort of increased involvement of auditors. So just to start with some highlights, our empirical analysis is going to yield 3 main takeaways. So one is that when these requirements pass and there's an increased role for auditors in bank supervision, we do see an associated reduction in bank risk, right? So this is consistent with the benefits that were mentioned by the BCBS. Now, in order to shed some light on the mechanisms at play, we find evidence of 3 channels. So evidence suggests that these mandates reduce risk by improving regulation-based supervision, market discipline, and it helps supervisors with the broader supervisory process. And we'll talk a little bit about those 3 specific mechanisms when we look at the results a bit later. And then finally, there's benefits there, but these are not without costs. So we had a look at some lending profitability. We find there's a reduction in lending activity, a reduction in profitability following these mandates, and some preliminary analysis indicates that the fees paid to auditors also increase. So this suggests that shareholders are actually bearing at least some of the costs here attached with this sort of additional reporting. So it brings us to sort of the first part of our study, so we can implement the empirics, which is determining the extent of auditor involvement. So as a starting point, we used Hannah and their contacts at the EEFC, who had access to all 28 European regulators. So we were able to survey them and receive responses from every single one and the EBA. And this process started in 2017 with many, many follow-up emails, conversations to really get at what was the extent of their requirements in their own countries. So we asked them and we focused on 3 dimensions. And these dimensions are sort of loosely based on what we saw in the Basel Committee guidelines about what's an effective relationship. So the first one was, we wanted to know, does a supervisor require additional reporting directly from the auditor? And what we meant by that, we put an example of a long form audit report in the question when we asked them. But effectively what we're trying to get at there is any type of expanded report or any other report, right? Any other private reporting channel that goes directly from the auditor to the supervisor. So the key point here is we did have to follow up with every single one of the regulators after this, just to clarify exactly what we're looking for, which is this reporting above and beyond sort of the standard statutory audit reports. The next one we went into and asked them was, do any of the supervisors actually require the auditors to provide additional assurance on capital ratios or solvency ratios, right? Or other specific, you can think of operational market risk, other specific regulatory items or inputs. Now, this kind of assurance is well outside the normal scope of assurance that an auditor is going to provide in a financial statement. And then finally, we wanted to get an idea of sort of just the conversations and some soft information transfer. So we asked them about required meetings. So we weren't trying to, a lot of them came back and said we meet ad hoc when there's a reason to, but what we sort of went back, followed up, and we said, no, we want to know, do you have sort of requirements in place that says periodically you are to discuss, or you will meet with an individual external auditor to discuss their client, that bank's performance. So we then asked for the specific mandates. So once they sort of answered these questions and we went back and forth, we said, look, can you guys sort of point to the national regulation or circular or mandate that sort of put this in play in your country? So we try to get as much information as possible about the nature of the mandates and sort of the nature of the information provided to the supervisor from the auditor. So this kind of, after much discussion and review of the relevant regulation, we sort of went back and forth a lot. We're able to put together table 1, which outlines the extent of mandated auditor reporting across countries. So there's a lot more if you go and take a look at table 1, and obviously in the appendix, we speak a lot about the actual survey and there's some quoted responses and things like that. But here you can see the staggered nature of the adoptions across countries actually provide a nice setting with which to test the research design. We did put in table 1, we try to put the national regulation that houses the requirements where we could be sure, and we provide a little bit more detail on the meetings, because there was a lot more sort of heterogeneity in the type of meeting. So you can take a look at those footnotes if you're interested. So it brings us to the first set of empirical analysis, looking at bank risk, right? So this was sort of one of the main benefits that was cited in that BCBS guidelines about, helping it to affect supervision to reduce bank risk. So bank risk is multidimensional. It's a difficult construct to capture. To do this, we're going to try and triangulate the results by providing 3 related empirical measures. So we look at credit risk via CDS spreads, as a measure from the credit markets. This is fairly well known. This obviously has drawbacks in the fact that we can only get this for a subset of publicly listed banks. We also look at NPLs, which is going to capture sort of our risk and loan portfolio. Then we look at a measure that we get from SNL, which is the counterparty credit risk. Now, this is a much broader measure. It was in Pillar 2, but it's actually a lot more related to it's been updated in the Pillar 3 requirements, disclosure requirements. This is a much broader measure that's going to capture the exposure in the derivatives on the OTC, the exchange traded stuff. That's a lot of the activity that is missing, right, from what we're going to get from the NPL. So this is a much broader measure capturing the risky exposures of banks. So we hope that between these 3, we can provide some consistent evidence about the movement in bank risk related to these mandated auditor reporting. So the design, to test it, we're going to use sort of the following model. Observations are at the bank year. The key point I want to make here with this slide is just that the mandatory auditor reporting, which is our variable of interest, this is going to be turned on if a company is in a jurisdiction that has implemented either the additional reporting requirement, that first dimension, or the supervisor requires additional assurance on capital ratios or other information, which is that second dimension from those 3 dimensions of auditor involvement. So we're focusing on the first 2 for the purposes of the initial empirical analysis. So we have the staggered adoption in the mandates. So sort of standard practice here, we can put in a bank fixed effect, a year fixed effect, several bank and country level controls, and then this will sort of resemble more the Bertrand and Muller-Nathan approach. So the main findings, when we just throw them all in there, we put in pre-mandate, which is going to capture the year prior to each of these mandates, which will give us some comfort of parallel trends. We find generally consistent across the board that there is a reduction in our bank risk variables following the mandated auditor reporting requirements. CDS isn't loading, but it's sort of right on the margin, but pretty strong results for counterparty risk and the NPLs. Now, at this point, given our setting, right, common with cross-country regulation-based research, we're going to have identification issues. In particular, we got issues with selection, and the potential for confounding concurrent regulations is always a threat. So we try to do a variety of things to address this, to at least try and mitigate this as much as we can. I'll just point out a few of them, but there's a lot in the paper. So PSM, we do a propensity score matching. That's sort of table 4, the next table you'll be looking at if you're following along in the paper, where we match at the bank year, at the bank level, and we do it in the year just prior. So here, we're only going to limit it to treatment firms that enact a regulation during our sample period, which is 2009 to 2018. And we sort of have this synthetic post, which is for the matched control variable, we'll turn on the post sort of commensurate to when we turn it on for the treatment. So this gives us a little bit more comfort. And if you take a look at those results, you find the results hold. We can also do a within country analysis because the UK enacted these mandates based on banks that had larger than 50 billion in total assets. So we can actually look at sort of the banks around that 50 billion cutoff, and we find results that within the UK, we still see this reduction in bank risk for banks that were subject to this additional regulation. We control for the staggered adoption of Basel regimes. Right, we put that control in all countries. This is kind of important because that's one of the bigger threats to our validity there. We know that the Basel reporting regimes are sort of implemented over time, but staggered throughout the EU. So we have a variable that will sort of control for that. And on top of that, we just review the national regulations and these progress reports from the BCBS to make sure that where we see big change, right, in terms of other regulations, and if that happens to be right around when our treatment's kicking in for that particular country, we just want to be aware of it. And if you take a look at some of the robustness tests, you'll see we sort of drop each individual country from the analysis just to make sure it's still there for everyone else. And of course, the survey discussions help a lot here because we can go back and lean on that in terms of corroborating our empirical findings. And a lot of that's in the internet appendix, but I'll talk about it. So now I'll take you to the 3 channels about how auditors may enhance supervision, like I said. Our first channel is a regulation-based supervision. So the argument here is that regulation, vis-a-vis imposing these capital requirements, right, is going to be even more effective when you have the auditor providing explicit assurance on the ratios, or at least the inputs, right, like risk-weighted assets or something like that, at least the inputs into those ratios. So I put some examples of the responses on the slide here. Again, this is also in the paper and in the Internet Appendix, where you can see in a couple of countries, they do require specific assurance on prudential returns. They also do require some specific assurance on any report that has, the auditors have to verify the accuracy of the report that actually has some of these ratios and information. So to capture this channel, we're going to do two tests. We're going to go back to our sort of main empirical specification. We're going to put risk-weighted assets up there, with the idea being we're simply looking to see whether or not this mandate changes risk-weighted assets. We don't really have a directional prediction here because it will depend on if managers were manipulating beforehand, what's happening with sort of the fundamentals of the bank. But our idea is if this channel is not operating, we shouldn't see anything on the risk-weighted assets. So even after controlling for NPLs, right, we're finding a drop across risk-weighted assets, which gives us some comfort that the mandate themselves is actually impacting the risk-weighted assets. So the fact that they're requiring additional reporting, there's additional assurance, is playing through into the capital adequacy ratios. The next test we do is just, and it's sort of supplemental to the RWA, is just to take a look at, within treatment countries only, redefine mandatory reporting to switch on when the ratio assurance is present. We're just trying to provide some comfort, right, that in all countries with the ratio assurance, which should be the dimension of involvement that's more pertinent to the regulation-based supervision channel, in all the countries with the ratio assurance, we're still finding our results. That is, they're not driven, right? The reduction in risk that you saw before is not just driven solely by the additional reporting dimension. We just want to make sure it's there for all those countries that have the ratio assurance too. And we find it in the counterparty credit risk. It's the right direction, but not so much in the NPLs. The next channel is the market discipline channel. So this is predicated on the notion that information sharing between auditors and supervisors could improve the information environment, right? In the BCBS guidelines, they talk about increased audit quality. So basically they're talking about sort of audited financial statements. So to get at this, we're trying to capture basically, did these mandates improve the information environment? So to get at that, we look at this information imprecision variable, which is measured as a 1U CDS divided by the 5U CDS. It's used in prior literature to capture information risk in the credit markets. So we find a significant reduction across the imprecision variable, which shows us that following these mandates, there does seem to be an improvement in the information environment, at least in the debt markets, and debt market investors are better able to assess banks' risk profile following this. So this is consistent, we're going to argue, with improvements in monitoring. Then the next test we do on the same channel is a little bit more direct now, because we're going to look at LLPs, which is in the audited financials. And what we're trying to get at here is we're going to look at the regress to LLPs on the change in future change in NPLs to get an idea of timeliness. So if these mandates and this information sharing is helping the auditor sort of do their job better, then we should see maybe more timely loan loss provisions, which again, we're going to argue is consistent with an increase in sort of this monitoring channel. And we find that it does there. So the last channel we look at is a supervisory review process. And here we're looking at, this is basically the argument that supervisors may benefit from discussions, reporting, in planning and executing the bank reviews. So this is going to be a little bit more difficult to capture empirically, given the difficulty in trying to capture supervisory effort. That said, we have several survey responses that actually suggest the efficacy of this channel. As many explicitly stated to us, the information they get from the auditors does help them provide more efficient on-site examinations, as in they're better able to tailor their on-site examinations. They're also better able to plan and execute off-site examinations too, because the supervisors aren't visiting every bank. So given that, we managed to get some information on the number of site examination visits, right? So we got this from the national regulators, or they pointed us to the direction of the data where they could help. And what we look at here is just the number of site examination visits, and we find following the adoption of this additional mandatory reporting, we do see the visits go down. Now, just to be clear, we're not saying that they are performing less examinations per se, it's just they're able to do it a bit more efficiently, right? So coupled with the fact that we've already shown a reduction in bank risk, our argument is this is more along lines of efficiency gains. And again, this gels very nicely with some of the quotes we have from the regulators. And then there's a couple of sort of supplementary analysis to this, so I want to bring in the meetings, again, just to provide some additional evidence on this channel. This is where we thought the meetings would be a good proxy for this sort of additional information transfer, soft information that can broadly help regulators execute and be more effective in their supervision. So here again, we did the same thing. We sort of limit it to those that just have the meetings as well as the MAR, and we find a reduction in that. And then again, for resource constraint, the thinking being that perhaps this is going to be more beneficial for resource constrained regulators, right, that need to really be a little bit more efficient in the way they plan and execute the supervision, and we find results consistent there. We're going to push a little bit more on this in some future analysis. And now the final part of the paper, because I have a minute or two left, we wanted to look at some potential costs. So we're going to look at three sort of dimensions: profitability, lending, and a direct cost through looking at the fees paid to auditors. So we look at loan growth in the sort of 1, 2, 3 years out, and we do find declines in lending activity that's following these mandates, right? When we look at profitability, we also find a reduction in the profitability. So taking these two results together, right, if you couple this with the earlier findings, one could argue that the reduction in bank risk we found is accompanied with a reduction in lending. And given we're seeing profitability decreases, perhaps this is, you know, suggestive of it's a reduction in risky lending, right? This is how they're able to reduce that bank risk. And then on just the last cost, and this is sort of preliminary at the moment, we want to tighten the specification a bit. We're going to look at the direct costs in terms of total fees paid to auditors. So this is sort of a variant of an audit fee model, but we need to do a little bit more, and we're actually looking for alternative data sources. But we do find an increase in audit fees, again, following the mandate. So as coefficients look a little big, that's why we want to tighten this up a bit more. And with that, I'll leave you with the conclusion that, look, increased auditor involvement in bank supervision does matter. While we document a reduction in the risk, definitely seems as an accompanying cost with that. We inform an ongoing debate in terms of improving supervision and join an emerging literature, which is super interesting stuff on how to sort of understand the interactions between auditors and supervisors. So I know Steve Ryan has a paper on this, Alison Nicoletti is in that, Yadav has a paper as well. It's really, we think it's super interesting stuff. There's plenty more to learn in this area, and thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Emmanuel. Emmanuel told me he was a little nervous before it started, but he certainly didn't show it. He did a fantastic job, so well done. We've now got Mary Barth, who will discuss the paper, 20 to 25 minutes. Take it away, Mary.
Thank you, Wayne. I would like to thank the JAE editors for giving me the opportunity to discuss this interesting policy relevant paper together with Amir Amelzadeh from the University of Oxford. Emmanuel's done a nice job presenting the paper. Our discussion focuses on 4 main areas. The first is auditor reporting to bank supervisors. The second is bank supervisors' objective. Then we're going to talk about the bank risk tests and the channel tests and offer a few other comments. BDS focuses on auditor reporting to bank supervisors. Auditors know much about clients' financial situation and controls, and typically they reveal their knowledge through reports on financial statements and internal controls. However, auditors also provide other assurance, for example, signing tax returns, performing agreed upon procedures on contract terms such as loan covenants, and writing comfort letters in public offerings. With a push for more non-financial reporting, it seems likely this role for auditors will increase. Thus, I think it's important for us to understand how auditor involvement improves information quality and decisions based on that information. By focusing on benefits and costs of mandatory auditor reporting to bank supervisors in Europe, BDS is an important step down this path. The question also is timely. Bank supervisors in an increasing number of countries seek to leverage auditors' information in making bank supervision more effective. Late in the study sample period in the UK, the ICAEW issued a discussion paper soliciting comments on whether the role of bank auditors should be expanded. Bank supervisors' objective is to ensure safety and soundness of banks and thereby the banking system, and to promote and safeguard financial stability. The principles based on really three pillars: minimum capital requirements, supervisory review, and market discipline. And these are the three areas that the study focuses on. For each pillar, the supervisor has tools, and there is a potential for auditor involvement, as BDS explained. In pillar 1, the supervisor's tools include ratio of loss absorbing capital to risk-weighted assets, where the risk weights capture credit, counterparty, market, and operational risks. And the potential for auditor involvement includes providing assurance on inputs to regulatory capital calculation or providing insurance on the resulting capital ratios. For pillar 2, the supervisor considers additional risks such as interest rate risk and concentration risk, and assesses internal governance and controls and risk management processes, and conducts on-site inspections. The potential auditor involvement here is to help assess the internal models and processes and maybe highlight key audit matters. In pillar 3, the supervisor's tools include qualitative disclosures summarizing risk management objectives and policies, and quantitative disclosures of capital ratios and their components. Here, the auditor can help ensure compliance with disclosure requirements and provide assurance on qualitative disclosures. BDS studies the economic consequences of mandatory auditor reporting to bank supervisors. The key focus is on the role of auditor reporting in reducing bank risk, which is viewed as a benefit of the mandate. They also provide evidence on the costs of the mandate in terms of reduced lending and profitability associated with reduced bank risk, which is consistent with prior research, and higher audit costs because of increased auditor involvement. The study then provides evidence linking aspects of the three pillars of supervision to auditor reporting and reduced bank risk. However, reducing bank risk is not always a benefit. That is, zero risk is not necessarily the objective. If it were, a key bank function would be eliminated because banks would be unable to lend to any private sector entities because they're not risk-free. As a result, Pillar 1 of banking supervision requires each bank to have a minimum amount of regulatory capital, where that minimum depends on the riskiness of the bank's assets. This ratio helps identify safer and riskier banks. The bank's regulatory capital requirements, of course, is assessed every period. One can interpret the regulatory capital requirement as the regulator's assessment of whether risk reduction is desirable for a particular bank. For riskier banks, the regulators assess the costs associated with reduced risk as being less than the benefit of maintaining safety and soundness of banks and financial stability. Thus, for riskier banks, risk reduction from auditor reporting would be more consistent with effective supervision, despite the documented costs. On the other hand, safer banks don't need to reduce risk or bear those costs. Thus, for safer banks, risk reduction from auditor reporting would be more consistent with regulatory overreach, which results in safer banks bearing unnecessary costs. The study employs three measures of bank risk. The first two, counterparty risk and non-performing loans, are available for most of the sample banks, both publicly listed and non-listed. The third, as Emmanuel explained, are CDS spreads, which is available for a small group of large publicly listed banks, which comprise less than 3.5% of the study's observation. Given the focus on reduction of bank risk as an economic consequence of mandatory auditor reporting to bank supervisors, one would expect the measures to capture bank economic risk. However, counterparty risk and non-performing loans are part of the supervisory regime being examined, which unfortunately clouds interpretation of the results. The minimum capital requirement is based on regulatory capital divided by risk-weighted assets. And then the bank needs to have a minimum set by the regulator. Risk-weighted assets include assets with credit risk, counterparty risk, market risk, operational risk, and other risk. The counterparty risk variable the study uses is the log of the sum of the risk-weighted assets for credit risk, counterparty risk, and other risk. This variable averages more than 80% of risk-weighted assets and is 99% correlated with it. Non-performing loans is part of the risk-weighted assets for credit risk. How much of non-performing loans is included in risk-weighted assets depends on how much of the non-performing loans the bank has included in its provision for loan losses and thus has been deducted from capital. The non-performing loan variable is non-performing loans divided by total loans. Before turning to the results, it's important to understand the sample composition. The study is based on mandatory auditor reporting for banks in 28 EU countries. 14 mandate additional reporting or ratio assurance by auditors. These are the treatment countries in the sample. 14 countries have no mandate. These are the control countries. Of the 14 that mandate auditor reporting, 5 of them did so before the sample period, which means mandatory auditor reporting equals 1 for banks in these countries in all years. Mandatory auditor reporting equals 0 for banks in control countries in all years. Because each bank is associated with a single country for the entire sample period, and all analysis include bank fixed effects, the observations from these 19 countries do not contribute to the estimating the coefficient on mandatory auditor reporting, which is the main variable interest. Although these observations could help identify control variable coefficients, they could introduce noise or bias if the coefficients differ across countries. The identification of mandatory auditor reporting coefficient comes from variation in when the mandate begins in the 9 countries that began the mandate during the 2009 to 2018 sample period. Thus, it's a bit unclear as to why observations from the other 19 countries need to be included in the empirical tests. Regarding the main results, as Emmanuel said, the study finds that mandatory auditor reporting is associated with significantly lower bank risk. Specifically, it's significantly lower counterparty risk for medium-sized banks, lower non-performing loans for medium-sized banks or all banks as long as Slovenia and Hungary are included in the sample, and CDS spreads, which are available for large banks. BDS explains that the results hold for medium-sized banks rather than large or small ones. But the results based on CDS spreads and on counterparty risk for UK banks relate to large banks, not medium-sized banks, which raises the question of how to interpret these seemingly inconsistent findings. As mentioned earlier, 2 of the bank risk measures are part of the supervisory regime, which clouds inferences. However, there are measures of economic bank risk not related to regulatory capital that could address this issue. For example, for all banks, might consider the volatility of earnings, implied credit ratings, or future interest expense. And for public banks, we might consider equity return volatility or distance to default measures. Considering public banks separately is feasible. Although the descriptives for the public indicator variable are not included in Table 2, they are in Table 1 in connection with the analysis of audit fees. For that analysis, there are 1,155 observations for public banks, which is almost double the number of observations for CDS spreads. BDS uses a variety of measures to link aspects of the 3 pillars of bank supervision to mandatory auditor reporting. The first, with respect to regulation-based supervision, they use risk-weighted assets divided by total assets and whether the auditor provides ratio assurance. For the supervisory review process, they look at country-level on-site examinations, supervisor mandatory meetings, and the number of staff of the supervisor. And for enhanced market discipline, they look at the CDS ratio and the extent to which loan loss provisions predict future non-performing loans. Taken as a whole, the evidence lends support to there being a link between the channels and auditor reporting and bank risk as measured by counterparty risk. However, the channel analyses have different objectives, I believe, and take on different forms, including which observations are included. Each channel measure is a dependent or explanatory variable, but not both. In these 4 analyses, the channel is a dependent variable and mandatory auditor reporting is the explanatory variable. But there are no tests of the link between the channel and bank risk. So these are not really channels to bank risk, but have other objectives. In these 3 analyses, the channel interacted with mandatory reporting as the explanatory variable and bank risk is the dependent variable. Unfortunately, the main effects are not reported, so we can't determine the channel's total effect on bank risks. We have a few other comments on these tests. Given the counterparty risk is a large portion of risk-weighted assets, this first result with respect to risk-weighted assets feels like the main Table 3 results all over again. However, for reasons explained earlier, it seems more sensible to me that the risk-weighted assets is appropriate as a channel than as a measure of bank economic risk. But that raises the question of why auditor reporting results in lower risk-weighted assets. As Emmanuel explained, they don't have a directional prediction, but aren't surprised with a negative coefficient. Banks have incentives to report lower risk-weighted assets. So if banks are free to manipulate risk-weighted assets, we would expect risk-weighted assets to be lower than the bank's risk justifies. If auditors prevent this manipulation, then risk-weighted assets would be higher, not lower. If the bank's economic risk is lower, risk-weighted assets would also be lower. Thus, observing lower risk-weighted assets could mean either more manipulation or lower risk. The assumption seems to be that with more auditor reporting, manipulation is ruled out, and thus lower risk-weighted assets means lower risk. However, this doesn't address the question of why auditor involvement reduces bank risk-weighted assets in the first place. With respect to ratio assurance, and this is a minor point, here they include only treatment countries in the test. As mentioned earlier, this approach probably is more appropriate, but it wasn't clear why the change of the specification for this test from the main test regarding bank risk. It seems that the bank fixed effects would subsume the effects of other countries here, just as they do in the main analysis. With respect to market discipline, the loan loss provision test focuses on whether the interaction between mandatory auditor reporting and future change in non-performing loans is significantly associated with current period loan loss provision. The story is that loan loss provisions that are more predictive of non-performing loans result from better auditing and provide better information to the market, thereby enhancing market discipline. However, during the sample period, auditors had to apply the incurred loss model, which is not designed to be predictive of future losses. Thus, it's unclear why auditing enhances the predictability of loan loss provisions for future non-performing loans. And the third channel, with respect to supervisory review, it's difficult for me to think of fewer on-site examinations as more effective supervision. Maybe it's more efficient supervision, and the same is true of resource constraint, but the results do suggest that on-site examinations and auditor reporting are substitutes, which in turn suggest cost savings for the regulator. The meeting results seems important because meetings are a potential venue for sharing soft information and interpreting hard information. But the test is a bit mysterious, at least to us. The mystery involves the sample composition and variable assignment. When defining treatment countries, required annual meetings was ignored. Thus, insights obtainable from the existence of required meetings in control countries are foregone. Apparently, the meeting requirement is not part of the regulation mandating additional auditor reporting or ratio assurance. But the paper doesn't mention what year the required meetings begin, so it's not possible for us to determine whether this is the case. We just wonder whether not digging deeper into the meetings channel could be a missed opportunity, depending on when the meeting requirements begins in each country. With respect to the channels, we also have identified some alternative channel measures that might be helpful. One is using the difference between standardized and bank-specific risk-weighted assets approach. In the bank-specific approach, the bank uses its internal ratings based on its internal models. Perhaps auditors can help assess the bank's models or resulting risk weights more in that circumstance than in the circumstance when they use standardized risk weights. And with respect to market discipline, we had three measures in mind. The first is standard measures of audit quality from the auditing literature and tests of whether the effects are larger for listed versus non-listed banks. It seems that listed banks would be more affected by market discipline than non-listed banks. And also standard measures of information environment or information asymmetry, which would only be available probably for listed banks. We applaud BDES for doing survey and incorporating the insights from it into design. I'm sure this took a lot of time and energy, and it's very important to reach out to people who are actually doing these things. And we think the survey provides an added dimension to the analyses. It's an opportunity to learn what information is exchanged in meetings, but we would really like to know more. Some more structured analysis of the survey responses would be interesting. Do the survey respondents provide insights to actually what transpires, what kind of information is exchanged in these meetings? And it would be helpful to have a little more information about the detail of the surveys responses themselves, such as what positions at the supervisor the respondents hold, and why they're unable to verify regulation for Netherlands and Lithuania. With regard to mandatory auditor reporting, the audit reports include key audit matters beginning in 2017. And we couldn't help but wonder whether this implies whether that auditor reporting effectively is mandatory in all countries in 2017 and 2018, the last 2 sample years. If the information in key audit matters is different, what is the difference and does it matter? With respect to the channels, the paper mentions that different levels of assurance are required for ratios, but they don't explain which country differed or what level of assurance is required. And it'd be interesting to see whether the level of assurance affects the outcome of the results. Standard errors are sometimes double clustered, sometimes not. They probably should always be double clustered. And it would really help the reader to provide descriptive statistics, including correlations for all the variables, at least speaking as one reader or 2 readers of the paper. The study provides evidence on economic consequences of auditor reporting to bank supervisors. Starts out with the benefit of reduced bank risk and associated costs of reduced lending and decreased profitability, as well as higher audit costs. Along the way, the study finds that lower supervisor costs associated with substitution of auditor involvement in supervisor on-site exams, which conserves resources for more resource-constrained supervisors. And they also find better information to the market as evidenced by lower CDS spread ratios. Thinking about the study led us to add costs associated with unnecessary risk reduction for safer banks and potentially less market discipline benefit for non-listed banks, as well as other potential variation costs and benefits for different types of banks. Combining these together with yet unidentified costs and benefits has the potential to determine whether the mandate is effective regulation or regulatory overreach, which is, I think, what we would really like to know. BDS finds that risk is lower after mandatory auditor reporting to bank supervisors, which confirms that auditors can play a role in regulatory supervision. BDS concludes that the mandate has economic consequences in the form of benefits as well as costs. However, a comprehensive assessment of whether the benefits of the mandate outweigh its costs is really left for future research. Regardless, the study is an important step forward in understanding the role auditors can and do play in improving information available to key decision makers other than through auditor reports on financial statements and internal controls. Importance of this expanded role will only increase in the future. Thank you, and I look forward to hearing everyone else's comments on the paper.
Great. Thanks, Mary. I'd actually like to, before I give Emmanuel a minute or 2, I'd actually like to, if Mary could stay there somewhere, I'd actually like to ask her a question. So one of the things that I was thinking about when I looked at this paper for the first time is I was kind of curious as to whether this communication between auditors and regulators had been considered outside of the banking segment. So, you know, I would think that, you know, securities and exchange regulators being concerned about financial reporting risk may get some information from auditors that they might use in terms of their regulatory objectives. So has there been any discussion of that either in Europe or in the US, or what are your general thoughts on that?
I'm not aware of any active discussion about it, but it is the case sometimes when a company will take a position in their financial reports, the SEC or someone else will send comment letters and ask for either a written response from the auditors or even a meeting with the auditors to discuss why they agreed or disagreed with a particular position that the auditor took. So the meetings are not unheard of, but I don't know that the research has addressed these and looked into them and to assess costs and benefits. And I'm not aware of any active discussion to expand it.
Okay, great. Emmanuel, do you want to take a minute or 2 to respond to anything?
Yeah, I can just take a minute. One, I'd just like to thank Mary for the comments. It's great stuff. We'll definitely, with the additional measures, we really appreciate that because obviously we're still trying to push some of these tests. With the CAMs, we think that's a really good point. So in 2017 now, you are going to have these expanded audit reports with these key audit matters, right, within Europe. That wasn't what we were trying to capture with the additional reporting channel. It looks like we may have captured some of that anyway. So it'll be interesting to sort of see what happens with our results just in the last few years, because I think you're probably right. Maybe in some countries that didn't have this mandate, now those supervisors are looking at some of the information that these other supervisors that did have the mandate looking at, and maybe that can help. I mean, we think we can push more a little bit on the meetings, like you said, and on the capital, on the ratio assurance as well, which should be helpful. The other thing, so with the LLP as well, we agree the incurred loss model, in theory, shouldn't be predictive, but I mean, we know there's some subjectivity and discretion there a little bit, right? I mean, banks even during the crisis were sort of told that their LLPs were not as timely as us, and this is during when they had an incurred loss model. The last thing we wanted to say is that we like that idea of the ratio assurance and the different levels. We can probably tease that out from some of the responses, because you can tell by the way they write if it's positive or negative assurance that they're kind of getting at. So we can definitely do more on that, and we really like the idea of looking at this risky versus safe to get at that overreach. We think there's a lot more that can be done there. We left the meetings out because we tried to ask them what is discussed. How do these work? That was a little difficult to tease out exactly what's going on there, but we have enough variation, I think, in the requirements. And some supervisors require meetings with the auditor during the planning and then before the audit report is signed, which is just crazy to us to think that the supervisor is actually involved in the planning stages of an audit. So we can definitely push a little bit more on that. But yeah, thank you again. I'll just get straight into the Q&As. Obviously, a lot more we can do on this paper, and looking forward to it. Thank you again, Mary.
Great, very good. Henry Friedman.
Hey, thanks. Really interesting paper on a lot of different dimensions. So I guess what I'm trying to do is figure out what's going on in the regulatory environment, and with the following sense. So it seems like at least now banks are supervised by their home country in large part, but can operate across the EU. So it seems there's some really interesting incentives going on. For instance, if my home regulator might have incentives for me to, upon bank default, really protect local creditors and kind of screw over foreign creditors, subject to however much the EU gets involved. So I guess what I'm wondering is to what role does basically the local regulator for a regional market potentially play in this? And on the empirical side, I'm wondering if you think any of these measures of bank portfolio riskiness would be affected by how much does the bank serve its its country level market versus being a broader EU bank. And I imagine you have both one country and multi-country banks in the sample.
Yeah, so that is, yeah. No, good, I'm unmuted. Yeah, so that's actually a great point. That's something that's come up a couple of times and we haven't dug into it yet. We definitely do have some banks that are going to go across multiple jurisdictions. Our understanding is that actually they're going to be under where they operate. I think the supervisory is going to be under whatever jurisdiction they're in. We've asked a couple of regulators specifically about this, and actually haven't got too clear of an answer. The one, the banks we know are definitely under two umbrellas, are your large and your systematically important banks, because they're going to be under the SSM now with the ECB. So we're sort of looking at what happens with those guys as well. So we do have some evidence where actually our results are not in the systemically important banks, which we think gel with the medium size because they're already sort of looked at. But what we want to do, which I think could really help with the identification, is take a look at banks that are in multiple jurisdictions, where one actually had the mandate, the other one didn't, and then kind of see how that impacts things. But that's on the growing list of to do.
Regina?
Yeah, it's a very interesting paper. I enjoy reading it, very interesting results, but I feel I struggle how to interpret the results in terms of the cost versus benefits. And it's related to many of the Mary's points. For example, you show that lending goes down and riskiness goes down. What does it mean for the borrowers? Do banks just ration out risky borrowers because they would like now to show better ratios? Or do they become more efficient and lending? And I think this is very critical for the consequences of this regulation, what happens, because probably what regulators don't want, they don't want just bank to limit credit to borrowers. So I felt this is something that was very missing for me in the paper. So what is the outcome? Is it a good outcome because banks become more efficient because they know they're better monitor, or is it bad outcome because there's some extra supervision that limit credit to borrowers that should get credit?
So, yeah, I mean, we agree. I don't have an answer for you now on that one. I would say that I'm not sure if it's a hugely efficient outcome, I think, given that we see the reduction in profitability. That was actually one of the other, I didn't mention it, but this was one of the other costs that was discussed in the consultation period for the Basel guidelines. It is the demand for the risky lending isn't going to dry up. So then people were saying, is this going to lead to sort of an emergence in these costs in terms of like shadow banking, in the sense that it could lead to more system-wide fragility, because the banks that could do this actually efficiently were sort of tying their hands a bit. I guess that's going to sort of mirror sort of Mary's point on we need to do more on what's sort of the ex-ante safe banks, risky banks, and then see if we can tease out the effect there, and then go look at the, make some inferences based on that. But I mean, I'm hearing a consistent point that this is sort of the direction of the paper is going to have to push.
Yeah, I'm not sure you can get access to shadow banking lending. Also, there's some data at the country level, but potentially you can see if other banks that are not subject to regulation pick up this slack, right? If the bank that affected, there is a reduction in lending, but somebody else at least covered borrowers, so that the consequences at the country or euro level are not as severe as if nobody now serves this borrower. So that may be an option to go.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. That's a great idea. Thank you.
Stephen Katzenmeyer.
Thanks, Wayne. So I'm still trying to get a handle for myself on what exactly conceptually is driving this. And I'm not sure I fully understand the conceptual differences between the three channels outlined in the paper, but from my perspective, there's only two basic things that can be going on. Either A, the auditor is communicating more effectively with supervisors, or B, the auditor is doing more work. We're expanding the scope of auditor services. So an example of a pure communication effect, as has already been mentioned in the previous comment, would be something analogous to critical audit matter or key audit matter disclosures, which to my understanding don't expand what the auditor is supposed to be doing, but simply attempt to communicate that more effectively to investors. I'll just say it's a hard sell to think that that effect alone, not on critical audit matters, but on whatever we're communicating to the supervisors, would lead to these differences, because, in some sense, what part of our clean audit opinion didn't you understand? I mean, it's not that tough in the sense that they did assurance on the financial statements, presumably opined that the financial statements are not materially misstated. And so just communicating that conclusion more effectively doesn't seem to do it. And so that leaves an expansion of scope of auditor services, which I think there's a lot more potential for. And, the paper hints at that and uses this risk-weighted asset assurance as an example. I wish I knew more about the survey. I tend not to read online appendices, so I didn't read the guts of that thing. But if it's just risk-weighted assets, I think Mary raised an excellent point, which is the intuition would suggest that what's happening before we expand that auditor service is that management has a moral hazard temptation to underreport risks. And so we're reining that in by having the auditor provide assurance on risk inputs to the regulator. But if doing so, then you would think that would say, no, you're reporting risk too low, it should be higher. And we're seeing it go the exact opposite direction. So if it's purely a reining in or a disciplining effect of you can't underreport your risks anymore, would you expect the opposite effect on risk-weighted assets? So in a nutshell, to sum up, and I'll be quiet, would you say if you had to choose between a communication effect or an expansion of scope of services effect, what's the driving horse here? And if it's expansion of services, how can more accuracy on risk inputs lead to lower risk? Because that flies in the face of management's presumed temptation to underreport risks anyway.
Yeah, so that's there's a lot to unpack there.
A mouthful,
If I
I'm
had,
sorry.
if I mean, I guess my co-authors don't want me sitting here picking one way or the other. I would say it's a bit of both. And this, I mean, the reason like we can't sort of pick a horse in this race is because we're still trying to push these regulators to understand again exactly, like give us one of these private reports, tell us what's being discussed, because they're telling us, at least in some instances, that they're increasing the scope of what the auditor is actually doing. I mean, the fact that they're providing, or the fact that they're saying you need to, for the capital ratios, for instance, that is well outside the financial statement audit. So if they're providing assurance on all these regulatory adjustments, which yes, we're going to start with the financials, but then we're going to go on and adjust some more, then that's more sort of the expansion of effort. But the argument is it also allows then the supervisors to perhaps rely on the numbers a bit more, and then they can go and tailor their efforts into sort of other things they're doing. So this is sort of the black box that we have been trying to unpack. Probably, obviously,
Mary's point, and I want to attribute it to Mary because she raised it in her discussion, but I came up with the same thing. But do you agree with the basic point that if auditors are reining in and disciplining management from underreporting risks or doing things they might be able to get away with without anyone opining on it, that would have, at least in itself, the opposite effect of what you're finding?
That I wasn't, I mean, if the risk-weighted assets are going down, I mean, that could also be that they're actually reining in, there's a real effect there, right? Because that's something we also started thinking about. So if your risk-weighted assets are going down, it could be now you're just making higher quality loans.
You're making higher quality loans because the auditor,
and you're also maybe you're also maybe undertaking sort of less, you know, less risky behaviors. Because I think underpinning this, we also have the notion that there is a little bit of that going on in terms of a real effect. I'm not sure how much we sort of alluded to that in the paper, but I mean, if we're finding that the lending is going down, the profitability is going down, this to us is sort of mentioning that managers are realizing there's enhanced scrutiny with this. And, you know, on top of that, they're probably adjusting their behaviors as such. So we think there's, with the communication, everything going on too, it could just be the managers also realize there's this sort of ex-ante monitoring, this ex-ante discipline that's also happening. So the reduction, I mean, we didn't want to play it up sort of too much. That's why we went in there saying it's not a direction. We just wanted to see if there's an impact on the risk weights. The fact that it's going down, the fact that we have the lending and the profitability stuff, I mean, to us, that also suggested a little bit of an element of a real effect there. And the fact that the fees are going up to the auditors also suggests an expansion of the scope in what they're doing, right?
Okay, let's move to Andrew.
Right. Hey, Emmanuel. Enjoyed the paper and enjoyed the discussion as well. I was curious what you know about or what you can see about the auditors. So it seems like a natural thing to look at is how long the auditor and client have been together, and maybe how many financial institution audits that the auditor does, with the idea that the scope for information sharing should be a lot greater when the auditor actually has better information about what's actually going on.
That's actually a really good point. We wanted to do a lot on the audit. The issue why we stopped and why it's not in this version, but that's why I said on the fee results, we're looking for alternative data sources. The data you get from SNL, which is where we got everything else, so we sort of want to keep a consistent data source. Even for the fees, they didn't give us historical data. You sort of just get current everything. So they weren't giving us, I mean, the fact that we could run some fee analysis using in another version, because there's actually some FactSet data that you're seeing here, was because ATICM went back and sort of begged them to give us the historical data that we knew they had. So we can probably get a lot more from SNL on this. And I think the idea of like at least figuring out how long the audit tenure is a great point. We've reached out to some auditors since we've discussed with the supervisors, and we have sort of those discussions in the paper. The other thing we wanted to do is take it from the audit perspective as well and sort of say, okay, you guys are subject to this mandate. Can you tell us things that you've changed or things that you've done? Because I think that really would close the loop a little bit on some of the questions we're getting here. So we've sent those out. We are yet to hear, from some of the auditors that we're going for. But we can definitely do a lot on the audit side of things. I mean, the paper's already pretty big. So we're just sort of figuring out if we put it in this or if we sort of do the same thing from the audit side.
You can always cut the appendix down a little bit if you're looking for space.
Yeah, that's true. Well, we kind of like the survey, like putting in the quotes and things like that. That kind of got a bit more. I mean, I feel like I do agree with Mary. There's a lot more we can take from the survey to actually and then put in the empirics, which I think is sort of where we're going in the next iteration of the paper.
Scott?
Yeah, very interesting paper, and I learned a lot. I was just wondering if it's possible that your findings are driven by the new regulation affecting how auditors do their job. I mean, based on prior research and Allison's thesis, we learned that regulators have different objectives than auditors, at least for provision timeliness. So that is it possible that audit regulators and auditors in the new regime are willing to, for example, relax the documentation requirement that may lead to less timely provisions? And as a second and related question, is it possible that the treatment countries are those where regulators push for the expected loss model, as 2014 happens to be the year in which IFRS 9 is passed? Thanks.
Yeah, so with thanks for that. I'm not sure I got the last part of the question, but with the first part on, do we think the mandate is changing the way auditors do their job? I think that's yes. We also kind of alluded to that on I think that's sort of part of our market discipline channel. The argument there was, look, for that to work, we're looking at improvements in the information environment. And specifically, one of the things mentioned in those BCBS guidelines was the fact that you're making the auditor either do additional work or have additional assurance or reporting channels can make them better at their job, right? And that's why we actually do the LLP test, so where we find sort of the timeliness goes up. So we do actually think that it's changing. We're going to say it's enhancing supervisory efforts and effectiveness as well, but we do actually think a little part of this is going to be the auditor effort going into it. So I'm not sure that takes away if we're sort of caring about the full cost and benefit of the mandate themselves. But that's something, again, as Andrew said, can you push more a little bit on the auditor and sort of tease out informational disadvantages and where you might see they're doing more or less work, where they could be more or less helpful to the supervisor, things like that. I mean, there's a lot more that we can do on the audit side of things as well. But we do think it's a little bit of both, the supervisory effort, but also this indirect effect. And I think we have a little bit in the paper in the introduction on that, but probably need to be a bit more clearer.
All right, I'm going to give Phil Stockin a chance, and then we'll give Regina a second bite at the apple.
Hey, thank you, Wayne. You have some very striking results, and I was curious about whether we can use your results to speak to models of issuer pay, for instance, in debt markets, or how we compensate auditors for the services that they provide. In particular, we know from models of strategic communication, like, for instance, Crawford and Sobel, that the alignment of incentives is really important. And so here, when we have the auditors reporting to the supervisor, you would imagine that the interest might be a little bit more aligned than the interest between the auditor and the audit committee or the bank management. And so is it possible then that we're seeing improved auditing and improved understanding of the financial position of the bank because of the strengthened alignment between the bank supervisor and the auditor, and therefore better communication of the underlying economics? And if that is then the case, it might be quite your results might well speak to ways of improving the audit function by changing how auditors are compensated. Currently, of course, we know they're compensated, or the audit fees are determined by firm management, but there might be a role then to have audit fees being determined by supervisors. And so this might be an extension of your bank. So, Emmanuel, I'm curious about your thoughts.
Yeah, I must say I haven't thought about that, but I like that idea a lot. Does this say anything about how the auditors might be compensated? Is actually something that our co-author Hannah has spoken about a few times. But I definitely think you're right about the alignment of interest, right? Because you would think the external auditor should be a little bit more closer aligned to the supervisors. Interestingly, the concerns on confidentiality and privacy concerns that were raised, which I think sort of speak to this a little bit. The Basel Committee's comment on that was there's a little footnote in the guidelines that say in countries that have already done something like this, where we're mandating and getting them to talk to us, there doesn't seem to be any sort of privacy or confidentiality or ethical issues. So I think you're probably right in the sense that that to me is a little bit more evidence that interests are sort of more aligned, and that could speak to sort of what we're finding. I mean, the supervisors seem to think that these orders are quite forthcoming and the information they get is extremely helpful. They're keen to say that they don't reduce their effort. They just simply say that it makes their effort a lot more efficient. And these auditors come with much more timely information. So I think there's definitely something to go down that route.
Regina?
Yeah, I think we discussed here a lot two main players in this paper. They're auditors and supervisors, but you also allude to the market discipline, which I found very interesting. But again, I struggle to really understand how market discipline works in this case, because I think for market discipline to work, you need investors to have some knowledge, right, of this communication. And I wasn't exactly sure how information environment is improved. I know you used Duffy and Lambda measure and CDS spread show that there's something with the market discipline, but it wasn't exactly clear how market discipline is achieved. Is it achieved because banks have better reporting quality following auditors' intervention, or some through other channel? I think that can also help maybe address some other comments, because if market discipline is important as one of the Basel pillars, then it can add to what regulators and auditors do and the interaction between auditors and regulators.
Yeah, agree. I mean, we do think, and I think that's why we sort of did that LLP test, that there is an increase in the quality, in the audit quality, and that is going to feed through in the market discipline test for sure. Yes, we do just use that the information risk to sort of then infer that there must have been an increase in an improvement in the information environment, which will sort of help with the discipline. I mean, the discipline we had in sort of mind here is sort of any sort of stakeholder or any sort of debt market participant, things like that. We need to think a little bit more on that one. The discipline channel, we think we're going to get at by looking at the audit outputs, because that's how the discipline channel is discussed in the guidelines. And then that again sort of fits into what sort of Steve was saying and what we're getting pushed on before, and Andrew, and what we're getting pushed on before, even Phil, right, with is it the auditors that are doing a little bit more work, which should improve? One, they could be doing more work to improve what the information they give to the supervisor, but this could also have the feedback effect of just making them also just improving the quality of the audit product that they're doing too. Because the whole point of, and the main goal behind those regulations of the relations between an auditor and a supervisor is actually just to improve the quality of the external audit. So within that document, it actually talks about things that they expect the audit committee to be doing, talks about their roles that they expect that the auditor should be doing in order for the quality output. And then there's just a couple of principles that talk about that relationship. So, you know, we think at least from the monitoring and the discipline mechanism, that's going to come from higher quality audit outputs, which is a financial statement stuff. But I don't think that then rules out more effective supervision, right? So I wouldn't turn around and say that this mandate simply makes auditors audit better, and therefore the financial statements are of high quality, and that'll help. I think that may be a feedback effect in the background, but the auditors are still doing additional work. Those additional reports are above and beyond any audit report that they sign and release, right? The capital ratio assurance is above and beyond the normal assurance they provide on the financial statements. So in doing this additional work, the argument is that maybe they're also creating a high quality audit output too, and then you're going to have both channels sort of helping with the discipline.
I didn't mean that it subsumes regulators, but it may be helpful for the paper to show how market discipline works, because it's more important in your setting that has been reflected so far.
Yeah, so we can push on that a bit more.
Okay, so seeing no further questions, I want to thank Emmanuel and Mary and the audience participants for a lively discussion. Excellent paper and discussion. And that brings to the close this virtual conference. First, I want to thank the people that came to the wine tasting last night. And I thought it was a lot of fun. At one point, we had somewhere between 60 and 70 people there. There were 5 lucky winners of a bottle of wine, which was kind of fun. We had a special guest, SP Kotari, showed up to heckle me and tell me that he wouldn't even use my wines for cooking. So that was nice. We had the folks at MIT, Rodrigo and Nemeth and Michelle Hanlon were all out on a patio. I think by the end of it, it was roughly 10 o'clock and Nemeth and Rodrigo were on their 5th bottle of wine. I think Michelle was just there to make sure they didn't fall off the balcony. I want to thank the authors for agreeing to present the papers and for doing such an excellent job. I thought it was a very diverse and interesting set of papers. I want to thank the discussants for all the time and effort that they put into discussing the papers. I thought it was a great set of discussions. People, definitely took it seriously and gave us a lot of excellent things to think about. Certainly want to thank all the participants. We certainly couldn't have done this without you. Not only the ones that are here on the Zoom, but also the ones that are live streaming out on YouTube. I appreciate them showing up as well. Although this isn't obviously the ideal setting to have a conference, one of the advantages is that we were able to give access to the largest audience that we've ever been able to give for our conference. It's also kind of interesting to see what everybody has in their living room, so that's kind of a nice side effect as well. I want to thank the people that helped organize the conference, Frank Fardone and Chris Awani and the Wharton IT people. So they did a ton of work. Bob Holthausen also did a lot of work. I didn't do very much work at all. So do not thank me, thank them. They did most of everything. I just want to say in closing, I hope that 2021 is a better year in terms of conferences and interactions. I hope that you and your families stay healthy and safe. And I hope that we can get together for a glass of wine and different kind of social interactions next year. So thanks for coming and take care.